meet at a grave time following the 3 January United States military action in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The broad outlines of the events of Saturday have been widely reported. Early that day, U.S. forces were active across Caracas and in the northern states of Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira. The extent of casualties resulting from these actions remains undetermined. In a statement on social media on Saturday, President Donald Trump announced the conduct of a, I quote, large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, end quote. During a press conference on Saturday, President Trump stated, and I quote again, "We are going to run the country until such time that we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition," end quote. The government of Venezuela has characterized the United States' action as a military aggression carried out in civilian and military areas and as a flagrant violation of the Charter, posing a threat to international and regional peace and security. As we speak, President Maduro is being held in New York, accused by U.S. authorities, along with his wife, Celia Flores, of serious criminal offenses. What is less certain is the immediate future of Venezuela. I am deeply concerned about the possible intensification of the instability in the country, the potential impact on the region, and the precedent it may set for how relations between and among states are conducted. Mr. President, the situation in Venezuela has been a matter of regional and international concern for many years now. Attention on the country only grew following the contested presidential elections in July 2024. The panel of electoral experts I appointed at the Venezuelan government's request to accompany the elections highlighted serious issues. We have consistently called for the full transparency and the complete publication of the results of the elections. As reported to the Council on 23 December, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has cataloged serious violations. On 3 January, Venezuelan interim President Delcy Rodriguez invoked an emergency decree throughout the national territory, extending additional security powers to the government. Mr. President, the latest developments follow a period of heightened tensions beginning in mid-August, as discussed in this Council on 2 previous occasions. I have consistently stressed the imperative of full respect by all for international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, which provides the foundation for the maintenance of international peace and security. I remain deeply concerned that rules of international law have not been respected with regard to the 3 January military action. The Charter enshrines the prohibition of the threat or use of force, political independence of any state. The maintenance of international peace and security depends on the continued commitment of all member states to adhere to all the provisions of the Charter. Mr. President, Venezuela has experienced decades of internal instability and social and economic turmoil. Democracy has been undermined. Millions of its people have fled the country. The situation is critical, but it is still possible to prevent a wider and more destructive conflagration. I call on all Venezuelan actors to engage in an inclusive, democratic dialogue in which all sectors of society can determine their future. This entails the full respect of human rights, the rule of law, and the sovereign will of the Venezuelan people. I also urge Venezuela's neighbors and the international community more broadly to act in a spirit of solidarity and in adherence to the principles, laws, and rules erected to promote peaceful coexistence. I welcome and am ready to support all efforts President, Excellencies, in situations as confused as complex as the one we now face, It is important to stick to principles. Respect for the UN Charter and all other applicable legal frameworks to safeguard peace and security. Respect for the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states. The prohibition of the threat or use of force. The power of the law must prevail. International law contains tools to address issues such as illicit traffic in narcotics, disputes about resources, and human rights concerns. This is the route we need to take. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefings. I now give the floor to Mr. Jeffrey Sachs.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the issue before the Council today is not the character of the government of Venezuela. The issue is whether any member state, by force, coercion, or economic strangulation, has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. This question goes directly to Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The Council must decide whether that prohibition is to be upheld or abandoned. Abandoning it would carry consequences of the gravest kind. Let me offer some background. Since 1947, the United States foreign policy has repeatedly employed force, covert action, and political manipulation to bring about regime change in other countries. This is a matter of carefully documented historical record. In her book, Covert Regime Change, political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke documents 70 attempted US regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 alone. These practices did not end with the Cold War. Since 1989, major United States regime change operations undertaken without authorization by the Security Council have included, among the most consequential, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria beginning in 2011, Honduras 2009, Ukraine 2014, and Venezuela from 2002 onward. The methods employed are well established and well documented. They include open warfare, covert intelligence operations, instigation of unrest, support for armed groups, manipulation of mass and social media, bribery of military and civilian officials, targeted assassinations, false flag operations, and economic warfare. These measures are illegal under the UN Charter, and they typically result in ongoing violence, lethal conflict, political instability, and deep suffering of the civilian population. The recent US record with respect to Venezuela is also clear. In April 2002, the US knew of and approved an attempted coup against the government. In the 2010s, the United States funded civil society groups actively engaged in anti-government protests. When the government cracked down on the protests, the US followed with a series of sanctions. In 2015, President Barack Obama declared Venezuela to be, and I quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. In 2017, at a dinner with Latin American leaders on the margin of the UN General Assembly, President Trump openly discussed the option of the US invading Venezuela to overthrow the government. During 2017 to 2020, the United States imposed sweeping sanctions on the state oil company PDVSA. Oil production fell by 75% from 2016 to 2020, and the real GDP per capita declined by 62%. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly voted overwhelmingly against such unilateral coercive measures. Under international law, only the Security Council has the authority to impose such measures. On the 23rd of January 2019, the United States unilaterally recognized Mr. Juan Guaido as interim president, and a few days later froze approximately $7 billion of Venezuelan sovereign assets held abroad and gave the designated authority over certain of these assets. These actions form part of a continuous U.S. regime change effort spanning more than 2 decades. In the past year, the United States has carried out bombing operations in 7 countries, none of which were authorized by the UN Security Council, and none of which were undertaken in lawful self-defense under the Charter. The targeted countries include Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and now Venezuela. In the past month, President Trump has issued direct threats against 6 UN member states, including Colombia, Denmark, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and of course, Venezuela. Members of the Council are not called upon to judge Nicolas Maduro. They are not called upon to assess whether the recent U.S. attack and ongoing naval quarantine results in freedom or in subjugation. Members of the Council are called upon to defend international law, and specifically the UN Charter. The realist school of international relations, articulated most brilliantly by John Mearsheimer, accurately describes the condition of international anarchy as the tragedy of great power politics. Realism is therefore a description, not a solution for peace. Its own conclusion is that anarchy leads to tragedy. In the aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations was created to end the tragedy through the application of international law. Yet the world's leading nations failed to defend international law in the 1930s, leading to renewed global war. The United Nations emerged from that catastrophe as humanity's second great effort to place international law above international anarchy. In the words of the Charter, the UN was created, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Given that we are in the nuclear age, failure cannot be repeated. Humanity would perish. There would be no third chance. To fulfill its responsibilities under the Charter, the Security Council should immediately affirm the following actions. The United States shall immediately cease and desist from all explicit and implicit threats or use of force against Venezuela. The United States shall terminate its naval quarantine and all related coercive military measures undertaken in the absence of authorization by the UN Security Council. The United States shall immediately withdraw its military forces from within and along the perimeter of Venezuela, including intelligence, naval, air, and other forward deployed assets positioned for coercive purposes. Venezuela shall adhere to the UN Charter and to the human rights protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Secretary General, I recommend, should immediately appoint a special envoy mandated to engage relevant Venezuelan and international stakeholders and to report back to the Security Council within 14 days with recommendations consistent with the Charter, and the Security Council should remain urgently seized of this matter. All member states should refrain from unilateral threats, coercive measures, or armed actions undertaken outside the authority of the UN Security Council. In closing, Mr. President and distinguished members of the Council, peace and the survival of humanity depend on whether the United Nations Charter remains a living instrument of international law or is allowed to wither into irrelevance. That is the choice before this Council today. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sachs for his briefings. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. My apology. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Please give the translation. Buenos días, embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de estados y
ambassadors,
gobiernos. Gracias
representatives
por esta
of
oportunidad.
states and governments. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Sí, no me escuchan.
Can you hear me?
Aló, aló, ¿me
Can you
escuchan?
hear me?
¿Me
We can hear
escuchan?
you,
Disculpa,
yeah.
ya estoy aquí. Excuse me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Buenos días, señores embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes del Estado.
ambassadors, representatives
Gracias por esta
of
oportunidad
heads of
de
state and
presentar los
government.
resultados
Thank
de
you
investigaciones que
to
desde Transparencia
enable me to
Venezuela
tell you something about Transparency
hemos estado
Venezuela,
desarrollando para
the work that we have been doing.
para la okay. He organizado
We have organized
la información que voy a presentar
I've
en 5 puntos.
I've organized some information I'm
Me
going to put
oigo
forward to you in
me
5
oigo-
points.
¿Cómo puedo bajar el volumen? Bueno, he
Continue.
organizado la información que voy a presentarles en 5 puntos.
I've
para
arranged the
aprovechar los
information I'm
pocos
going
minutos que
to
tengo.
give to you in
Punto
around
número
5
uno.
points. Let me
La
make the
red de
most of
gran
my time.
corrupción
First of
transnacional
all,
de origen
one,
venezolano
the
tiene presencia con empresas,
corruption
propiedades y
in
actividades
Venezuela
en 73
sees
países del mundo.
is seen in 73 countries of the world. We have organized, we've seen hundreds of cases that we have documented over the
Más de
years,
500 y 600
more
casos en
than
diferentes
500,
países.
600 cases in
Solo
various
en los
countries.
sistemas de justicia
Continue, we can hear you. Go ahead, continue. Can you hear us? We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Solo en los sistemas de justicia de 30 países
We've looked at the justice
se
systems of
procesaron
30 countries,
172 casos de
and
gran corrupción,
172 cases
donde
were
el 60%
dealt
de
with for
ellos
corruption,
suma más de
and
72.000 millones
more
de
than
dólares.
$72 trillion were involved.
Esos 72 millones de dólares
$1
están
million
comprometidos
were
son
involved.
dinero público venezolano.
This was public
Nicolás
Venezuelan
Maduro
money.
y su
Nicolas
familia
Maduro and his
son el
family.
fondo de la red. Y el puente estructural
The interpreter cannot hear
y
the
donde
speaker.
Petróleos de Venezuela ha sido el instrumento central, involucrada directa e indirectamente en el 90%
It
de
was a
los casos
system
de
that was
corrupción
involved in
que hemos
90%
identificado.
of the corruption
Punto número
cases.
2.
Point number
Las
2,
organizaciones criminales nacionales
the
y
national
internacionales
criminal
tienen una
organizations.
relación simbiótica con la administración de Nicolás Maduro.
The interpreter cannot hear the speech
utilizando
to
las estructuras
provide
del
sufficient
Estado
interpretation. I
para
apologize.
facilitar, soportar, impulsar, proteger y dirigir las operaciones ilícitas. Las economías ilícitas de oro, droga, extorsión y trata de
Miss
personas
Freitas,
alcanzaron en
Miss Freitas,
2024
Miss
8.000
Freitas,
billones de dólares.
can you
según
hear
nuestra
us?
estimación.
Miss Freitas,
De la producción de oro, ¿sí?
can you hear us? The interpreters cannot hear you. Can you slow down and raise your voice a little bit?
Hay un delay.
There's a delay, says the speaker. The problem the interpreter is having is with the quality of the sound, which is insufficient for interpretation.
Sí,
It's not the speed.
Dígame. Sí, la oigo con delay. Sí, sí,
I'm
la oigo.
hearing you, but with a delay, says the
Sí, la
speaker.
escucho.
I can hear you, though.
Okay. Please proceed now.
Ok, perfecto.
Very well.
El punto número 2. Las
Point
organizaciones
two.
criminales nacionales e internacionales
National and international criminal organizations
tienen una relación simbiótica con la
have a
administración de Nicolás
symbiotic
Maduro,
relationship with the regime of Nicolas Maduro, sharing capacity, using the state structures to facilitate
impulsar, proteger y dirigir
their
las
work
operaciones
and to
ilícitas.
protect
Las
illicit
economías ilícitas
operations.
de oro,
in
drogas,
gold, for example,
extorsión y
drugs,
trata de
extortion,
personas,
and human trafficking.
según nuestras estimaciones,
And according to our estimates,
8.200.000 millones de dólares.
this
El de
accounts
la
for
producción
about
de oro, por
$8
ejemplo, solo se
billion.
reporta el
Gold, for
20%
example,
al
only
Tesoro
20%
Nacional.
is
El
reported
resto
to the
va
National
a
Treasury.
cuentas
The rest
privadas
goes to
de
private
miembros
accounts
aliados de
where
nuestro gobierno.
there are members and allies with the
Ese
government.
proceso minero, además, ha
This
destruido áreas completas de
mining
nuestro estado
industry
Bolívar,
has exploited
del Parque
so
Nacional
many
Canaima
people
y de
using
nuestro Amazonas.
national parks and also
Para
the
lavar el
Amazon
dinero
area.
de la
And then
corrupción
to
y del
launder the
crimen
money from
organizado, la
corruption,
red comparte
the
operaciones y
network
estructuras y mecanismos de lavado de dinero
has
muy
money laundering
sofisticados.
structures that are
Y
very
desde el
sophisticated.
2021
And since
utilizan las
2021,
criptoactivos a gran escala. El punto 3,
they've been involved in this work.
la gran
3,
corrupción y los ilícitos
great
son una de
corruption
las razones de reducción de los ingresos del Estado
has led
y
to
por
a
ende
decrease
del
in the
gasto
income
público,
of the
del
state and
empleo de
therefore
calidad,
public
de los servicios
expenditure
básicos,
and therefore
de la
affecting the
economía
quality of
del país
basic
100 veces
services.
arriba desde
The
hace
current
décadas.
economy
Tampoco
is
el
in
dinero para
crisis.
pagar la
There's
deuda,
no
que hoy
money
suma
either to service the
167
debt.
mil millones de dólares que tiene a Venezuela en cesación de pagos selectivos, en un default técnico, desde el
Although
2017,
Venezuela has been in
donde el primer
technical
acreedor
default
es
since
China, al que
2017.
aún le debemos más de 15.000 millones de dólares.
We owe more than
Punto 4.
$15 million.
Los
Four,
venezolanos hemos tenido que aprender a
Venezuelans
vivir
have
con
had to
pocas
learn
horas de
to
agua y luz
live with
en
just
gran
a
parte del
few
país, desde
hours
Caracas,
of
inclusive en las otras ciudades del
electricity
país.
per day in very many
Hay que,
parts of the
hemos
country.
aprendido a protegernos
And we've
de la
learned to
extorsión
protect
diaria
ourselves
y
from
generalizada
daily
desde los grupos
extortion
armados
from the
colombianos, desde los grupos de
from the
crimen
armed Colombian
organizado,
groups or the
pero también
organized crime
lamentablemente
groups, but
desde los funcionarios del Estado.
also
Millones
elements
de
of the
familias
state.
tienen una sola comida al día,
So many
con
families
bajo
only
nivel
have one
calórico.
meal per
Los
day
datos de
below the
desnutrición
calories
y
that they need,
nutrición empeoran
affecting
cada
their
día.
nutrition, which is
Los
getting worse
programas
day by
humanitarios
day.
no son suficientes.
Humanitarian programs are not
Se
sufficient.
eliminó el sistema de contrapesos y la independencia entre los poderes públicos. Ese es mi quinto punto.
And then
El
5, there's
grupo en el
no
poder
checks
hoy
and
en día en
balances
Venezuela
between
tiene capturado toda la
government
estructura
departments.
institucional,
The
comenzando
government
por el
has
sistema de
captured
justicia
all
y con la
institutions,
industria
beginning
petrolera,
with the
principal
justice
generadora de
institutions
ingresos
and
y de
also
los
the
oligopolios
oil
de los
company
sectores económicos
responsible
clave.
for the majority of
Para
income
mantener
for the
el
country. In
control y
order
la
to maintain
impunidad de los
control
negocios ilícitos,
and the impunity of these illicit
aplican un
operations,
sistema represivo cada
a
vez más
repressive
atroz.
system that's getting
Hoy,
worse and worse is being applied.
además, hay más de
And
1.000
to
presos
date, there
políticos,
are more
cifra
than
que cambia
1,000
tras una
political
aterradora
prisoners.
puerta giratoria. Para finales de año,
At
86
the
de
end
esos
of the
presos políticos se
year,
desconocía su paradero y 26 personas ya han muerto bajo custodia del Estado
26
durante torturas
people
o por falta de
died during
atención médica. La misión de
torture or because
determinación de
of a
los
lack
hechos
of
de
medical
Venezuela de
care.
Naciones Unidas ha documentado cientos de
United
torturas
Nations has
y esto
documented many of
no se ha
these
detenido aún.
cases.
Para cambiar esta realidad necesitamos un Estado íntegro y transparente que
We
rinda
need a
cuentas,
transparent
que
state that is
garantice el Estado de
accountable,
Derecho y
that
los
will
derechos
guarantee the
humanos,
rule of
que
law and
proteja
human
los
rights,
recursos
that will
públicos para el beneficio
protect
de todos sin
public
privilegios,
goods for
con
everyone
un
without
sistema de justicia
privilege,
autónomo e
a
independiente.
system that's autonomous and
Necesitamos inversión en
independent.
capitales
We need
constructivos
investment
que nos
in
permitan
building
pagar la deuda,
capacity
pero también
that
crecer, sostener con dignidad a todos los venezolanos.
will
Que se
enable
respete
us to
la
have a
voluntad
dignified
del
life.
pueblo venezolano de
We
vivir
must respect the will
en
of the
democracia.
Venezuelan people
Por
to live
último,
in
una
peace and
petición,
democracy. And
es
finally, a
una súplica.
request
La
to
libertad
you.
para todos los presos
Freedom
políticos
for all
venezolanos.
political prisoners
Muchísimas
in the
gracias.
country. Thank you very much.
I thank to Ms. Freitas for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
Colombia agradece a
Colombia would like
Somalia
to thank
en su calidad
Somalia
de
in your
presidencia del
quality
Consejo de
as
Seguridad
President
por
of the
haber
Security
acogido
Council
con celeridad
for
nuestra
having
petición
quickly
para
responded to
convocar
our
esta
request to
reunión de
convene
emergencia,
this emergency meeting,
así como a China
as well
y
as thanking
Rusia
China and
por el
Russia
apoyo a
for
esta
their
convocatoria.
support
Le
for holding of
deseamos a
this
usted,
meeting.
señor
And we wish you,
presidente,
Mr. President,
una exitosa gestión durante este mes de enero,
a
en un
successful
momento
month
particularmente
managing the work of the Council at a particularly delicate time for international peace and security. I'd also like to thank Undersecretary General for Political Affairs and Peace Building of the United Nations and the invited briefers. We thank them all for their briefings. This is the first time Colombia is taking the floor in the Security Council as a non-permanent member for the period 2026-2027. Colombia is taking on this responsibility with a deep sense of duty, and we are going to do this from the first day, defending international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. International peace and security, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the prohibition of the use of force, sovereign equality, respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of all states. Colombia condemns categorically the events that occurred in the early morning of the 3rd of January in Venezuela, where we saw multiple explosions and air activity over Caracas and other areas of the country as part of a military attack carried out by the United States, which included bombings of civilian and military infrastructure, creating panic amongst the population. All of this represents clear violations of the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Venezuela. There is no justification whatsoever under any circumstances for the unilateral use of force to commit an act of aggression. Such actions constitute a serious violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition on the use or the threat of the use of force, the principle of the respect for sovereignty and the full authority of states over their territory, including their natural resources, the territorial integrity of states, and the principles of collective defense, particularly when they directly endanger the population and civilian assets. Defending these principles is not an option. Indeed, it's a common obligation that we have in order to preserve international peace and security. We need to remember that the provisions of the Charter allow for the use of force only under exceptional circumstances, in legitimate defense in the face of an armed attack, or when there is an express authorization by this Council in accordance with Chapter 7. And even in those cases, this does not amount to assuming political control of another state. In this regard, we reject any unilateral military action, any act that could worsen the situation or endanger the civilian population, and we would call for a de-escalation and non-resort to the use of force, which endangers people finding themselves in this delicate situation. They must be the absolute priority. We have learned from our experience that the civilian population is always the one that pays the highest price in armed conflict. Mr. President, Latin America and the Caribbean have proclaimed themselves to be a zone of peace, and this collective commitment and will of our region must be respected. Unilateral action that is contrary to international law endangers regional stability, increases insecurity, and worsens the already complex conditions being faced by the civilian population, with devastating effects that will transcend the sovereign borders of Venezuela to have a direct impact on countries of the region, such as Colombia. In order to act preventively, Colombia has engaged in measures to protect the civilian population and preserve the stability of the border, addressing the possible needs of the population, particularly the migrant population, in coordination with local authorities. Colombia has been and will continue to be show solidarity in receiving the Venezuelan people who, given the uncertainty created by these attacks, this may lead to a massive outflow of migration, which will require significant efforts in terms of resources and capacities to provide the necessary support and assistance to those areas affected by taking in the migrants. Mr. President, these actions that we have seen remind us of the worst interference in our area in the past, in our zone of peace, and calls to mind the commitment that we have as states to resolve our differences peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly a country that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, what then is the role of this council, and where are the foundations for international peace and security? We are accepting that the law and the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber. Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence or coercion, and it cannot be superseded either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity, and dignity, with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law, and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, our good offices available for a diplomatic way out of the current crisis in this brotherly country. We will meet our responsibility, primary responsibility, to maintain international peace and security. And given the seriousness of the events, we will continue to pay attention to this issue. And we'd also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for providing his good offices to defend the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, to activate channels for mediation available to him and facilitate dialogue with the parties concerned, in the search for alternatives that will make it possible to find a way out of the situation led by Venezuelans themselves and provide assistance to Venezuelans that need this. In conclusion, we'd urge the parties to exercise maximum caution and restraint, to de-escalate tensions and to follow dialogue and diplomatic channels and develop mechanisms to avoid continued flagrant violations of international law. This will require the help of the United Nations and of regional organizations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, we wish to congratulate you on your accession to the presidency of the Security Council. And second, we wish to welcome the newly elected members of the Security Council. The beginning of this new year shocked all of those throughout the world who cherished the hope that respect for international law and non-intervention in domestic affairs of other states, as well as a reliance upon diplomacy and seeking of compromise, became key principles in the work of the new U.S. administration. The assault against the leader of Venezuela, compounded by the deaths of dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban citizens, in the eyes of many, has become a harbinger of a turn back to the era of lawlessness and U.S. domination by force, chaos, and lawlessness, which continues to afflict dozens of states in various regions of the world. There is no and can be no justification for the crimes cynically perpetrated by the United States in Caracas. We firmly condemn the U.S. act of armed aggression against Venezuela in breach of all international legal norms. In connection with the confirmed reports about the presence of the abducted president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in the United States, today, as we are aware, they're in New York, we call upon, corrects the Speaker, the U.S. leadership to immediately release the legitimately elected president of an independent state and his spouse. Any problems existing or conflict between the United States and Venezuela need to be resolved through dialogue. And this is precisely what is enshrined in the UN Charter, the purposes and the principles of which a number of states in recent years have begun to apply selectively, depending upon the political landscape. Today, we are reaping the consequences of their recklessness and selectivity in matters related to respect for the norms of international law, which were linked to the so-called rules-based world order. Here is your rules-based world order in all of its glory, which is horrifying even the staunchest Atlanticists. Mr. President, we extend our firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the face of the external aggression. We firmly support and completely support the policy of the Bolivarian government, which is geared towards protection of their national interests and the sovereignty of the country. Washington's aggressive acts have already been condemned by many states and multilateral associations, including the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Union, as well as a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We hope that the international banditry will immediately be met with objective and comprehensive assessment at the international legal level with United Nations, universal mechanisms, and other multilateral formats being brought to bear. This process must not be impacted by the recognition or non-recognition by any given states or groups of states of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro. For this reason, unintelligible murmurings and attempts to avoid principled assessments by those who, in other circumstances, froth at the mouth and demand that others respect the UN Charter, today seem particularly hypocritical and unseemly. We hope you will recognize this, and we hope that you will abandon double standards and that you will not attempt to justify such an egregious act of aggression due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela's natural resources and the assertion of their hegemonical ambitions in Latin America. In this way, Washington is generating fresh momentum for neocolonialism and for imperialism, which were repeatedly, decisively condemned and repudiated by the peoples of this region and by the global South as a whole. Distinguished colleagues, under these circumstances, it is exceedingly important for the entire international community to unite and to definitively reject the methods and tools of U.S. military foreign policy, which have been demonstrated in the case of Venezuela. This is the only way it is possible to compel Washington to revisit and to abandon their dangerous misconceptions. As we stated during previous meetings on Venezuela, the bell now tolls across the region, ringing for every country of the Western Hemisphere. The bell is ringing for all UN member states and for the future of the organization itself. Failing to hear this call today is tantamount to projecting cowardice and a lack of principle, essentially blessing ongoing encroachments of international law and rejecting civilized international conduct as a whole. We cannot allow the United States to proclaim itself as some kind of a supreme judge which alone bears the right to invade any country, to label culprits, to hand down and to enforce punishments, irrespective of notions of international law, sovereignty, and non-intervention. Is this the world we sought to attain as we marked the 80th anniversary of the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, when we all signed on to the relevant Security Council presidential statement? Is this the aim of United Nations reform, which we all advocate? Or has the United Nations and Security Council thereof, do they no longer exist? And is there need now to seek from Washington a patent to rule, so to speak? And is the self-determination of every person's and their right to determine their future worthless? These are the questions that we all must address today. And if this response is sincere, if it is principled, then perhaps the U.S. leadership, too, which openly is asserting intention to run another country for the benefit of the United States, they will perhaps glance at their own constitution, their constitution of the United States, which begins with the words, "We the people of the United States," and will begin, in fact, to recognize the sovereignty of other states rather than deposing inconvenient regimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President.
中方支持安理会就美国对委内瑞拉发动军事打击召开紧急会议。感谢迪卡洛副秘书长宣读古特雷斯秘书长的通报。我认真听取了通报人的发言，欢迎委内瑞拉常驻代表和其他国家代表出席会议。1月3日，美国悍然对委内瑞拉发动大规模军事打击，强行控制委内瑞拉总统
forcibly seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and took them out of the country. It claimed that it will run Venezuela and even didn't rule out launching a second round of military operations on an even larger scale. China is deeply shocked by and strongly condemns the unilateral illegal and bullying acts of the U.S. For some time now, the international community has repeatedly expressed grave concern over the U.S. sanctions, blockade, and threats of force against Venezuela. The Council convened 2 emergency meetings, during which Secretary General Guterres, many Council members, and countries in the region and beyond unanimously called for abiding by the UN Charter and the international law, maintaining calm and restraint, resolving disputes peacefully, de-escalating tensions, and safeguarding regional stability. However, as a permanent member of the Council, the U.S. has disregarded the grave concerns of the international community, wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests, and seriously violated the principles of sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful settlement of international disputes, and the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. These principles constitute the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter and form the cornerstone of maintaining international peace and security. The U.S. has placed its own power above multilateralism and military action above diplomatic efforts, posing a grave threat to peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean, and indeed internationally. China firmly opposes this, and the international community has also expressed widespread grave concern and strong condemnation. We urge the U.S. to heed the overwhelming voice of the international community, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, cease infringing upon the sovereignty and security of other countries, stop toppling the government of Venezuela, and return to the path of political solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We call on the U.S. to ensure the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife and to release them at once. We support the Council in fulfilling its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and we support all efforts by the UN Secretary General, regional countries, and organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue and de-escalating the situation. President, the lessons of history are a stark warning. Military means are not the solution to problems, and the indiscriminate use of force will only lead to greater crisis. The U.S. bypassed the Council to launch military operations against Iraq, blatantly attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, and imposed economic sanctions, military strikes, and even armed occupations on multiple countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. These actions have caused persistent conflict, instability, and immense suffering for the ordinary people. Did these actions bring peace and stability? Did they bring development and prosperity? The international community sees this clearly. Venezuela is an independent sovereign state with every right to defend its sovereignty and national dignity. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are important forces in maintaining world peace and stability and promoting global development and prosperity, and they have every right to independently choose their development paths and partners. No country can act as the world's police, nor can any state presume to be the international judge. China firmly supports the government and people of Venezuela in safeguarding their sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests. We firmly support the regional countries in upholding the status of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. We demand that the United States change its course, cease its bullying and coercive practices, and develop relations and cooperation with regional countries on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and non-interference in international affairs. China stands ready to work with the regional countries and the international community to strengthen solidarity and cooperation, uphold fairness and justice, and jointly safeguard peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 members, namely the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and my own country, Liberia. We thank the presidency for promptly convening this important meeting. We congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month and warmly welcome all new members. The A3 appreciates USG DiCarlo's comprehensive briefing and listened carefully to the remarks offered by civil society representatives. We also welcome the representative of Venezuela and the representatives of the region to this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 aligns itself with the recent communique of the African Union on the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and continues to monitor developments there with deep concerns. In particular, we note reports regarding the detention of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and incidents involving Venezuelan institutions. Such developments present serious challenges not only to Venezuela's internal stability, but also underscore the imperative to safeguard the broader peace and security of the region. The A3 remains steadfast in its commitment to the fundamental principles of international law, including the full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations in the interest of regional stability and international peace. We believe these are essential foundations for international cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Our position underscores the importance of dialogue, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for constitutional and institutional frameworks. Mr. President, the complex situation in Venezuela requires a comprehensive response that is both inclusive and nationally owned. We continue to hold that a sustainable and peaceful resolution can only be found through constructive dialogue among Venezuelans themselves, with genuine respect for the aspiration and rights of the Venezuelan people, and with the constructive support of the international community. The A3 expresses its solidarity with the people of Venezuela and reiterates the African Union's commitment to peace, stability, and mutual respect among nations and regions. It's important for all parties, both within Venezuela and in the broader international community, to exercise restraint and responsibility, upholding international law and avoiding any action that could escalate tension or threaten regional stability. The A3 stands ready to support all efforts within this council and in cooperation with regional partners to facilitate a peaceful, inclusive, and lasting resolution to the situation in Venezuela. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you for chairing. And I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Freitas, for your briefing. And I'll point out that Mr. Freitas is in exile, having fled the regime. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for shedding a light on the true atrocities of the illegitimate Maduro regime. This past weekend, colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega. He was arrested, indicted, convicted in a court of law, served in prison in the United States and in Panama, and the Panamanian people, the American people, are safer for it. And undeniably, the region was more stable. This law enforcement action was directed consistent with the President of the United States' responsibility as Commander-in-Chief to protect Americans at home and abroad against a fugitive who is directly responsible for narco-terrorism that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and created destabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges for his involvement in a wide-ranging conspiracy to conduct narco-terrorism, to traffic cocaine and other drugs, and conducting international weapons trafficking. The overwhelming evidence of his crimes will be presented openly in U.S. court proceedings. Colleagues, Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He was an illegitimate so-called president. He was not a head of state. For years, Maduro and his cronies have manipulated Venezuela's electoral system to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short of the most basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credible elections. If the UN and the United Nations in this body confers legitimacy on an illegitimate narco-terrorist and the same treatment in this charter of a democratically elected president or head of state, what kind of organization is this? We should note that over 50 countries, many nations, including the European Union, including a number of Latin American countries in the region, and of course the United States, again, over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 elections and do not recognize him as Venezuela's legitimately elected president. Maduro unlawfully refused to peacefully cede power after the Venezuelan people voted him out of office in the 2024 election. So therefore, Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He is the head of a vicious foreign terrorist organization, Cartel de los Soles. This regime-sponsored enterprise coordinates with and relies on other vicious criminal organizations, namely Tren de Aragua, again, among others, to carry out its objective of using illegal narcotics as a weapon against the United States. And for its part, Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization with thousands of members, many of whom have unlawfully infiltrated the United States and are conducting irregular warfare and undertaking hostile actions against the American people and against the United States. It's terrorizing criminals commit brutal crimes, including murders, kidnappings, extortions, and human, drug, and weapons trafficking. This administration, President Trump, will not stand for it. In fact, in March of 2025, President Trump declared that Tren de Aragua is quote, Tren de Aragua is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco-terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Extendemos la más cordial bienvenida
I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of Bahrain, Colombia, Liberia, Latvia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and who have joined the Security Council as elected members and who are joining us today in the chamber. And we congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemarie DiCarlo, for her detailed report representing Secretary General Antonio Guterres. She's briefed us on the situation under discussion today. We're also very grateful for the very valuable presentations by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. In this context, the Republic of Panama would like to refer to the situation that has taken place in the territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which is of concern due to its possible impact on peace and regional stability. However, in the light of the unfortunate reality of the facts that we've seen, we now need to turn our attention constructively towards the future of Venezuela. However, it's important to point out that in terms of a constant principle of our foreign policy, Panama would like to reiterate our unfailing commitment to multilateralism, to the sovereignty of states, and to the unrestricted respect for international law, especially the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, including non-intervention, respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force. This is mentioned in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. These principles are, and they continue to be, the indispensable framework for the peaceful coexistence between nations. Panama also believes it's necessary to highlight that the situation Venezuela is facing is unfolding in an environment marked by the disregard for the will of its people, as well as by a sustained erosion of democratic institutions. In this regard, Panama reiterates that it does not and will not recognize the authoritarian and illegitimate regime that has held Venezuelan men and women hostage, plunged them into one of the gravest political, social, humanitarian, and security crises in our region. Unfortunately, we have witnessed how the situation has gradually deteriorated under the regime, especially over the last year, with increased systemic erosion of democracy, the hollowing out of institutions, and the rise of authoritarian and repressive practices, which have contributed to an unfortunate outcome and therefore cannot be ignored by the international community. In particular, it is essential to call for the unconditional release of persons detained for political reasons. Many of them have been deprived of their liberty merely for raising their voices in a context in which dissent is not tolerated. From this moment on, we must demand that all political prisoners that the regime continues to hold hostage, Venezuelans and foreigners alike, be released without delay. Their physical well-being and safety must be guaranteed. Likewise, freedom of expression and the unequivocal respect for human rights must be immediately ensured. In this context, Panama underscores that its position does not stem solely from a principled democratic solidarity, but also from direct impact. A Panamanian citizen, Mr. Olmedo Núñez, remains arbitrarily detained in Venezuela without formal charges, without due process, without full access to a defense, and without effective consular guarantees. Added to this is the human impact of a multidimensional crisis that has forced around 9 million Venezuelans, men and women, to leave their homes, compelled to live in displacement and vulnerability as a consequence of the institutional and social collapse generated by the regime. A crisis that has had significant regional repercussions, reflected both in the irregular migration flows from south to north of a significant number of Venezuelan nationals, as well as reverse migration movements, including also a lot of Venezuelans, the effects of which are felt particularly in countries of transit and destination that this affects, including Panama. And this has decisively contributed to illegal migration. In the face of this reality, Panama issues a clear and firm call for Venezuela's short-term future to be fully democratic. Power emanates from the people, and as stated by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Panama, José Raúl Molino, the people, the true sovereign, have already spoken at the polls, granting an indisputable victory with 70% of the votes on July 28, 2024, to the opposition candidate, Mr. Edmundo González Urrutia, as well as to Maria Corina Machado, who was prevented by the regime from running despite having won the primary with 93% of the votes on October 22, 2023. Additionally, the popularity of both has increased in recent months, including among police and military sectors. The elected government has the teams and work programs ready to be implemented immediately, guaranteeing an orderly transition that provides the rule of law, respect for human rights, and confidence. In line with this commitment, Panama proudly safeguards the electoral records that reliably certify said victory as testimony to the inalienable right of the Venezuelan people to determine their own political destiny. Recognizing any authority other than that of the elected president would amount to legitimizing electoral fraud, normalizing authoritarianism, and undermining the universal principle of free elections as the source of legitimacy. Likewise, any attempt to establish a permanent government headed by figures from the repressive apparatus, such as Delcy Rodriguez, would constitute continuity of the system and not a genuine transition. Any political solution must be peaceful, it must be democratic, and led by the Venezuelans, with the responsible assistance of the international community, including the United Nations and regional mechanisms such as the Organization of American States. Panama does not wish and would like to avoid a scenario in which Venezuela's reality simply evolves into a change from one crisis to another, one crisis replacing another. There can be no genuine transition with Madurismo if it remains. Or if we have the same power structures preserved under new names. Any arrangement that keeps figures associated with the repressive apparatus at the center of governance would, in practice, constitute continuity of the system and not a real transition. Comparative experience shows that merely nominal transitions tend to prolong conflicts, intensify migratory flows, and perpetuate regional instability to the detriment of international peace and security. Panama will always stand in solidarity with an orderly and democratic transition process, anchored in the popular will already expressed at the polls on July 28, 2024, aimed at restoring democratic institutions through an interim period strictly limited in time, the sole purpose of which is to create the conditions necessary for the exercise of the Venezuelan people's right to self-determination. As a country that recovered its democracy and sovereignty, Panama can state clearly that there can be no peace without legitimacy, nor legitimacy without democracy, and that every democracy is ultimately based on respect for the popular will. Mr. President, Panama, due to our commitment to multilateralism and international law, in its capacity as member of the Security Council, will continue to contribute responsibly to collective efforts aimed at preserving peace, strengthening democracy, and supporting legitimate and sustainable solutions anchored in the sovereign will of peoples and respect for international law. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the United Nations Security Council in January, and wish you all success. Latvia takes its seat on the Council with a profound sense of honor and responsibility for this role. And let me thank Under-Secretary General Rosemarie DiCarlo for today's briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, and I thank the invited briefers. The Security Council bears primary responsibility for the global efforts to uphold peace, security, and rule of law worldwide. Latvia recalls that under all circumstances, the principles of international law and the UN Charter must be upheld. All efforts now focus on ensuring de-escalation and stability in Venezuela based on inclusive dialogue and broad societal support. Latvia encourages all relevant actors to prioritize diplomatic efforts and work collectively towards a peaceful, democratic, and sustainable future for Venezuela. Latvia stands in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and their right to freedom and democracy, rights that were not respected by the Maduro regime during 2024 presidential elections and before, and which remain unmet to this day. The regime of Nicolas Maduro was rooted in mass repression, corruption, organized crime, including drug trafficking, and posed a grave threat to security of the region and the world. It has repeatedly violated the UN Charter and undermined international law, including through open support for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The Maduro regime does not represent the will of the Venezuelan people and has relied on widespread, systematic repressions of human rights across the country to maintain power. 8 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee the country since 2014. Latvia also remains committed to working jointly together with partners to counter global transnational organized crime networks, including in Latin America and Caribbean. Such criminal activities place the lives of countless people at grave risk, particularly women and children. Addressing these challenges requires sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Latvia continues to closely monitor the situation in Venezuela and stands prepared to continue working with its partners to support a peaceful, democratic, and just transition that reflects the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Undersecretary General Tikalo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. We also listened carefully to the briefing by Ms. de Freitas and Mr. Sachs. Mr. President, Denmark joins the Secretary General in expressing deep concern over the evolving situation in Venezuela. Since this Council met to discuss the situation 2 weeks ago, we have seen a drastic escalation, culminating in a large-scale military operation on January 3rd. At our last meeting, Denmark urged all actors to strictly adhere to international law and to de-escalate tensions and exercise the necessary restraint. Today, we echo the Secretary General in his concern regarding the worrying implications of this military action. Independent of the situation in Venezuela, these developments constitute a dangerous precedent. International law and the UN Charter, as a pillar of the international security architecture, must be respected by all states. Denmark recalls the foundational principle of international law that forbids states from threatening or using force against another state's territorial integrity and political independence. This imperative is enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Members of the UN Security Council have a special responsibility to uphold these principles. The principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. The inviolability of borders is not up for negotiation. These are universal, sacrosanct principles enshrined in international law. They apply everywhere. Mr. President, once again, Denmark calls on all parties to urgently de-escalate tensions that could threaten peace and stability in the region and beyond. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, as stated in the UN Charter. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to engage in dialogue and diplomacy. Denmark takes note of official statements from the United States government stating that the military operations are to combat drug trafficking and stem the illicit flow of illegal narcotics. Denmark shares the priority of combating organized crime and drug trafficking, while reiterating that counter-narcotic efforts, as all other efforts, must be conducted in strict accordance with international law, including the fundamental rules and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, against this backdrop, Denmark wishes to recall our solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Denmark does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, following the lack of transparency and integrity in the 2024 presidential elections, which failed to meet basic democratic standards. In Maduro's attempts to cling to power, his authoritarian regime grew increasingly oppressive. His regime bears responsibility for widespread and systematic violations of human rights against his fellow citizens, and he should be held accountable. The victims of the Maduro regime's alleged crimes against humanity have to be heard. The Venezuelan people have a right to democracy and self-determination exercised through peaceful, inclusive, and credible democratic processes, free from fear of political persecution, intimidation, or repression, and external political interference. This includes the rights of Venezuelans alone to determine their political, economic, and social future, without coercion, pressure, or manipulation by external actors. No state should seek to influence political outcomes in Venezuela through the use or threat of force or through other means inconsistent with international law. Venezuela's future can be decided only by the Venezuelans. We call on all parties and stakeholders to come together for a negotiated and peaceful transition to democratic rule in a process led by and owned by Venezuelans. At this critical and uncertain time, it is imperative that all parties fully respect human rights and international law. Denmark remains committed to supporting Venezuela and the aspirations of its people on its path to lasting political stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Somalia on the assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of January. And I thank our briefers for their remarks. Colleagues, the Venezuelan people have suffered for years. This Council now meets at a pivotal moment for Venezuela's future. Maduro's actions created extreme levels of poverty, violent repression, and failing basic services. His regime's rule precipitated a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom has long been clear that Maduro's claim to power was fraudulent. To date, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections, and independent domestic and international reports also observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. President, the United Kingdom wants to see a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. They deserve a government which reflects their vote at the ballot box and delivers a more stable, prosperous future for all Venezuelans. Finally, President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter pour votre présidence du Conseil de sécurité au mois de janvier. Je voudrais également remercier Madame Rosemary DiCarlo de nous avoir transmis les éléments du secrétaire général des Nations Unies au sujet du dernier développement intervenu au Venezuela. Monsieur le Président, la France est restée solidaire du peuple vénézuélien dans la crise qu'il traverse depuis de trop nombreuses années, et en particulier depuis l'été 2024. Le 28 juillet 2024, le peuple vénézuélien a exercé son droit de vote de façon pacifique pour déterminer l'avenir de son pays. Son droit à choisir ses dirigeants lui a néanmoins été confisqué
has been stripped away from the people by Nicolas Maduro. Must you recall the facts? The electoral process has been was marred by numerous irregularities, and the final counting of votes was marred by a flagrant lack of transparency.
Face à l'aspiration démocratique du peuple vénézuélien,
Nicolas Maduro has systematically responded with the repression of dissident voices, of members of the opposition and of civil society, as well as with numerous arbitrary detentions. France has always expressed itself with clarity about the fact that these practices are unacceptable and that respect for human rights must be upheld.
Mr.
President, the military operation which has led to the capture of Nicolas Maduro runs counter to the principle of peaceful dispute resolution and runs counter to the principle of non-use of force. The proliferation of violations of the Charter of the United Nations and the violations of international law by states vested with responsibility as permanent members of the Security Council chips away at the very foundation of the international order,
contrevenir aux principes de la Charte,
contravening the principles
parmi
of the
lesquels les
Charter,
principes de respect
including
de
the principle of respect
l'indépendance
for
et de
independence
l'intégrité
and the
territoriale des
territorial
États,
integrity of states,
mine les fondements des Nations Unies
undermines the
et
foundation of the United
fragilise la paix
Nations and
et la sécurité
weakens
internationale.
international peace and security.
La France
France
fidèle
remains
et engagée
faithful
pour le
and
respect de
committed
la
to
Charte des
respect for
Nations
the
Unies
Charter
et
of the
du
United
principe
Nations
de
and of
règlement
the
pacifique des
principle of
différends.
peaceful dispute
Nous
resolution.
devons mettre en œuvre ces
We
principes
have an obligation to uphold
en
these
tout temps
principles at all
et en
times
tout lieu.
and in all places.
Leur respect
Respect for
est
these
indispensable.
principles is indispensable.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
la France
France
réitère son attachement
wishes
au
to
respect de
reiterate
la
our commitment
volonté
to respect for
du
the,
peuple
for the
vénézuélien.
will of the Venezuelan
La
people.
transition qui s'ouvre à
The
présent pour le
transition which is
Venezuela doit être
currently
pacifique,
being opened up for
démocratique
Venezuela needs to be
et
peaceful
respectueuse des
and
choix du
democratic
peuple vénézuélien,
and
qui est un peuple
carried out in a
souverain.
manner which respects the choice of the Venezuelan people,
Cette
a sovereign
transition
people.
doit être
This
dirigée
transition
par
must be
et
led
pour
by
les Vénézuéliens.
and for the
La France se
Venezuelans.
tient prête avec les États
France
de la
stands
région et ses
ready,
partenaires de l'Union
alongside
européenne,
states in the region
à
and
soutenir
our
le dialogue
partners at the
en
European
vue de la
Union to
restauration de la
uphold
libre
dialogue
expression
with a view to the
démocratique au
restoration of the
Venezuela
free
et à
democratic
appuyer la
expression in
stabilité
Venezuela.
régionale.
We stand ready to support regional
Ce doit
stability.
être aussi
This
le rôle
also
de ce
needs to
Conseil.
be the
Je vous
role of
remercie.
the Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate first and foremost the Federal Republic of Somalia on its presidency of the Security Council during this month of January. We wish you every success. We also wish to take this opportunity to thank delegations whose mandate of the Council ended, namely Algeria, Guyana, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, as well as Slovenia. We wish to thank them for their significant contributions to the attainment of the goals and the mission of the Council. I also wish to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, for her valuable briefing related to the latest developments which have taken place in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I wish to thank other briefers as well. We appreciate the reaffirmation by His Excellency the Secretary General of the United Nations, reaffirmation of the commitment to the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations, a commitment to the peaceful diplomatic resolution of disputes. The Kingdom of Bahrain supports the call of the Secretary General for all stakeholders in Venezuela to engage in inclusive dialogue, dialogue which guarantees respect for international law, and this in order to ease tensions, to preserve regional stability, and to avoid any potential adverse repercussions for security and stability in the region. The Kingdom of Bahrain also extends its support for efforts undertaken at the regional and international levels in order to reduce tensions and to enhance diplomatic means in order to provide for international peace and security. The Kingdom stresses the importance of the promotion of international cooperation in order to support all regional and international efforts which are geared towards combating international organized crime, trafficking in drugs, as well as scourges which are related to this. This undermines the stability of societies, undermines achievement of sustainable development. Therefore, these issues need to be dealt with in accordance with international relevant conventions. By way of conclusion, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms our support for regional and international efforts to achieve a political, lasting solution in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This needs to be achieved through regional cooperation and with respect for national sovereignty. The goal is to provide for security and stability in Venezuela, to avoid risks of conflict and division, to protect civil peace, and to contribute to the preservation of regional security and stability, as well as international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by congratulating Somalia on its assumption of the presidency for this month and assuring you of my delegation's full support and cooperation. We welcome the new members joining the Council. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for reading out the remarks of the Secretary General and the valuable briefing. We also take note of the views shared by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela alongside the representatives of other countries from the region and beyond in the meeting. Mr. President, Pakistan views the recent developments in Venezuela with profound concern. In a world already beset by multiple crises, escalating tensions and instability in the Caribbean do not augur well for regional and international peace and security. The UN Charter enjoins us to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The UN Charter also binds member states to sovereign equality, non-interference in the internal affairs of others, and settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. Unilateral military action contravenes these sacrosanct principles and the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Such actions set dangerous precedents that risk eroding the foundations of the global legal framework. They also fuel instability, which, as history has shown time and again, can lead to unpredictable and uncontrollable outcomes for years to come. Mr. President, at this critical juncture, the path forward must be one of dialogue and diplomacy. Durable solutions to political differences can only be found through peaceful means, with full respect for the will of the Venezuelan people, free from any external interference. We hope that Latin American and the Caribbean region, as a zone of peace, will remain free from conflict and confrontation and continue its march towards enhanced regional cooperation and improved prosperity for the people. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, de-escalate tensions, pursue peaceful coexistence, refrain from any actions that could exacerbate the volatile situation, and engage in dialogue, including by utilizing the sincere offers of mediation. The good offices of the Secretary General also always remain available for that purpose. Lastly, Mr. President, I affirm Pakistan's commitment to contributing constructively to the discharge of the Security Council's primary responsibility for addressing the threat to international peace and security by diffusing tensions, promoting pacific settlement, and upholding respect for international law and the UN Charter. Peace and stability of Venezuela and the welfare and prosperity of its people, with full ownership, must be the overriding objective of all efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia for assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of January, and I would like to welcome the newly elected members joining the Council. I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, as well as Mr. Sachs and Ms. De Freitas for their remarks. Mr. President, Greece is closely monitoring developments in Venezuela. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to refrain from actions that would deepen the crisis and undermine prospects for peace and stability. Greece reiterates that the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including human rights law, must always be respected. We also recall the obligation of all parties to protect civilians, especially in times of heightened tensions. Greece shares the priority of combating transnational organized crime and drug trafficking, which pose a significant security threat worldwide. We reiterate that these challenges should be addressed through sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Mr. President, Greece firmly believes that dialogue and diplomacy are the only viable tools for a peaceful transition and a sustainable resolution of the crisis. We join the Secretary General in encouraging all actors in Venezuela to engage in inclusive and meaningful dialogue in full respect of human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. We have long been clear that Nicolas Maduro's and illegitimate president's claim to power lacks legitimacy. Greece has not recognized the results of the rigged elections of July 28, 2024, and has always supported initiatives aimed at achieving a democratic solution for Venezuela. We stand firmly with the people of Venezuela in their pursuit of a democratic future, and we express the hope that the recent events will lead to this effect. The voices of all Venezuelans need to be heard, and they deserve governance that reflects their will through peaceful and inclusive processes. In this spirit, we will continue to support efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful, negotiated transition that ensures the will of all Venezuelans is fully respected. Greece stands ready to support all regional and international efforts aimed at the peaceful resolution of the crisis in line with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for this statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Antes de abordar el fondo de
Before
nuestra
coming
intervención,
to the substance of our
consideramos
statement
necesario
today,
realizar una precisión de
I
carácter
think we
institucional.
need to make an institutional
Observamos con
clarification.
que se
We
intente
note with
presentar
concern
ante este Consejo de
that
Seguridad
an attempt is being
como una
made
supuesta
to
representante de la
present to
sociedad
the
civil
Security
a
Council
una persona cuya
a
trayectoria
supposed
pública ha estado
representative
marcada
of
por el
civil society,
financiamiento
a
sostenido
person whose
de
public career
gobiernos extranjeros y
trajectory bears the
corporaciones
hallmarks
transnacionales.
of sustained funding
Están
from foreign
las pruebas
governments
para quien quiera ver.
and transnational
Por años.
corporations. This has
Así
been the
como
case
por su
for years,
participación en
as well
procesos
as
de
participation in
desestabilización política
processes
y
of
promoción
political
de posturas
destabilization and
institucionales
the
en su
promotion
propio
of
país.
institutional breakdown
El uso
in her own
instrumental de esta
country.
figura
The
para
instrumental
legitimar
use
narrativas de
of this person to
confrontación,
legitimize
justificar el
narratives of
uso de la
confrontation,
fuerza
justify
o
the use of
minimizar
force,
violaciones del
or
derecho
minimize violations of
internacional
international
no
law
contribuye
does
a
not
los
contribute
propósitos de
in
este
any
Consejo
way to the
ni al
purposes of this
fortalecimiento del
Council or to
multilateralismo.
the strengthening of
Por el
multilateralism.
contrario, erosiona
On the
la
contrary,
credibilidad de los
it erodes
debates
the
y
credibility
distorsiona
of
la
the
naturaleza de
debates
este
and
órgano,
distorts the Security
llamado a preservar la
Council's
paz y la seguridad
mandate
internacional.
entrusted with the maintenance of
Ahora sí, entro en
international
materia.
peace and security.
Señor presidente, el 3 de enero del
Mr. President,
2026
on January 3rd,
constituye una fecha de profunda gravedad
January 3rd,
histórica,
2026 is a date of
no solo para
profound
Venezuela, sino
historical
para el sistema
significance,
internacional en
not
su
only for
conjunto.
Venezuela, but for the
Ese
international
día, la
system as a
República
whole.
Bolivariana de Venezuela
On
fue
that
objeto
day,
de un
the
ataque
Bolivarian
armado
Republic of Venezuela
ilegítimo,
was the target of
carente de
an
toda
illegitimate
justificación
armed
jurídica
attack, lacking
por
any
parte del
legal
gobierno de los
justification
Estados
by
Unidos
the
de
government
América,
of the United States
que
of
incluyó
America, which
bombardeos sobre su
included
territorio,
bombing of our
la
territory,
pérdida
the
de vidas
loss of
civiles y
civilian
militares,
and military
la
lives,
destrucción de
the destruction
infraestructura
of civilian
esencial y el
infrastructure,
secuestro
essential infrastructure, and the
del presidente
kidnapping
constitucional de la
of the
República,
constitutional
Nicolás Maduro, y de
president
la
of the
primera dama, Silvia
Republic, Nicolas Maduro Morris,
Venezuela
and the First
comparece
Lady
hoy
Celia
ante este
Flores.
Consejo
Venezuela comes before
desde
this
una
Council
convicción
today
profunda. La paz
with a
internacional
deep
solo puede
conviction that
sostenerse
international
si el
peace
derecho
can only be
internacional es
sustained if
respetado,
international
sin
law is
excepciones,
respected without
sin
exception,
dobles raseros
without double
y sin
standards,
interpretaciones
and without
selectivas.
selective interpretations.
Los hechos ocurridos el 3
The
de enero
events of January 3rd
constituyen una violación flagrante de la Carta de
constitute
las
a
Naciones Unidas,
flagrant
cometida
violation
por el
of the
gobierno
UN Charter,
estadounidense. En
perpetrated by
particular,
the US government,
la
in
violación del
particular,
principio
the
de igualdad
principal
soberana de
violation
los
of the
Estados,
principle of sovereign
la
equality of
violación de la
states, of
prohibición
the absolute
absoluta del
prohibition
uso o la
of the
amenaza del
use or
uso de la
threat of
fuerza
use of
contra la
force
integridad
against the
territorial o la
territorial
independencia
integrity or
política
political
de cualquier
independence
Estado,
of any state,
consagrada en el
as
artículo 2,
enshrined in
numeral 4
Article
de la
2,
Carta,
Paragraph 4,
y violación del deber de resolver las controversias
and a
por medios
violation of the
pacíficos.
duty to settle disputes by peaceful
Asimismo,
means.
estos actos vulneran
Similarly,
de manera
these
grave los
acts also
convenios de Ginebra
seriously
y sus
violate the
protocolos,
Geneva
al
Conventions and
haberse
its
producido
protocols,
ataques
as
indiscriminados
indiscriminate
contra la
attacks were
población
carried
civil
out
y
against
bienes
the
de carácter
civilian
civil.
population and
Se ha
assets.
violado también el derecho internacional de los derechos
International
humanos,
human rights law has also been violated,
particularmente el derecho a la
particularly
vida,
the right to
a la
life,
integridad personal
personal
y a la
integrity, and security.
De especial gravedad,
Of
el
particular
secuestro del
seriousness
presidente de la
is the
República
kidnapping of the
por parte del
President of the
gobierno de los
Republic
Estados
by
Unidos
the
de
government
América,
of the United
que
States of
constituye una
America,
transgresión
which
directa
constitutes a
de una
direct
norma
violation
esencial del
of an
orden
essential
jurídico
norm
internacional,
of the
cual
international
es
legal
la
order,
inmunidad personal de
namely
los
the
jefes de
personal
Estado en
immunity
ejercicio.
of heads of state in office.
Esta inmunidad
This
no
immunity
es un
is not
privilegio
an individual
individual,
privilege.
es una garantía
It is an
institucional
institutional
que
guarantee
protege la
that
soberanía del
protects the
Estado
sovereignty
y la
of states
estabilidad
and
del
the
sistema
stability of the
internacional.
international system.
Su desconocimiento
Its
nos
disregard card not only affects Venezuela, but also sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all states represented in this.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President, General Assembly Resolution 3314 clearly defines as an act of aggression the bombing of the territory of one state by the armed forces of another state, as well as the invasion or occupation, even without formal annexation. The events we are denouncing here unequivocally fit this definition. In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as the judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this U.S. aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure. When force is used to control resources, impose governments, or redesign states, we are faced with a logic that harks back to the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. Accepting such a logic would mean to open the door to a deeply unstable world in which countries with greater military capacities can decide by force the political and economic destinies of other states. This scenario not only threatens Venezuela, it threatens international peace and security as a whole. If the kidnapping of a head of state, the bombing of a sovereign country, and the open threat of further armed action are tolerated or downplayed, the message sent to the world is a devastating one, namely that the law is optional and that force is the true arbiter of international relations. Venezuela firmly believes in diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence among nations. That has always been our historical position, and it remains so today, even in the face of an aggression of this magnitude. It is precisely that commitment to peace, the one that was violated on the 3rd of January. Therefore, Venezuela urges the Security Council to fully assume its responsibility and to act in accordance with the mandate conferred upon it by the Charter of the United Nations. In that regard, we request, A, that the government of the United States of America be demanded to fully respect the immunities of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, as well as their immediate release and safe return to Venezuela. 2, that the use of force against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela be clearly and unequivocally condemned. Thirdly, that the principle of non-acquisition of territory or resource that measures aimed at de-escalation, the protection of the civilian population, and the restoration of international law be adopted. Mr. President, in spite of the seriousness of the events, Venezuela would like to inform this body and the international community that constitutional order has been preserved, and that the state exercises effective control over all of its territory.
conforme a nuestra
In
Constitución,
accordance with our Constitution,
vicepresidenta ejecutiva Delcy Rodríguez está
as acting
encargada de la
President
República,
of
la estabilidad y
stability
la paz
and internal peace.
Al pueblo venezolano queremos transmitirle un
We
mensaje
wish
de
to
serenidad.
convey a message of serenity, confidence, and hope to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela is a nation that believes in peace, work, and dignity. Our commitment is to diplomacy and law, and the law is firm and unwavering.
Defendemos nuestra
We
soberanía
defend
sin
our sovereignty
renunciar a
without
valores.
renouncing our values.
Apostamos por el diálogo sin
We bet
aceptar
on dialogue
imposiciones.
without accepting imposition.
Creemos en un futuro de
We believe in
convivencia,
a future of
desarrollo,
coexistence,
respeto
development,
entre
and
las
mutual respect among nations.
Confiamos en que este
We
Consejo de
trust that
Seguridad
the
sabrá
Security
parar
Council use the path of legality, collective responsibility, and
Muchas
peace.
gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I'll now give the floor.
Buenos días y muchas gracias,
Good morning,
señor presidente.
and thank you very much. The Argentine Republic values the decision and determination demonstrated by the President of the United States of America that resulted in the capture of the dictator Nicolas Maduro, leader of the cartel by Argentina in 2025. The Argentine Republic trusts that these events represent a decisive step forward against narco-terrorism that affects the region, and at the same time open a stage that will allow the Venezuelan people to fully recover democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, in accordance with the principles of international law, and put an end to the oppression exercised for years by the authoritarian regime that plunged the Venezuelan people into and forced 8 million Venezuelans to have to flee their country. Mr. President, the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro has not only constituted a direct threat to Venezuelan citizens through the systematic violation of human rights, the appropriation of the country's resources, and the destruction of democratic institutions, but also to the entire region by leading and exporting its networks of drug trafficking and organized crime. Since the inauguration of President Javier Milei, Argentina has been clear and consistent in its position regarding this situation. We have unequivocally denounced the lack of freedoms and the serious human rights violations, and we have actively contributed with determination and responsibility to international efforts. In March 2024, when others opted for inaction or ambiguity, Argentina granted diplomatic asylum to 6 Venezuelan opposition leaders, assuming an enormous challenge for our representation in Caracas. Subsequently, after denouncing the fraudulent nature of the result announced in the 28 July 2024 elections, and recognizing Edmundo González Urrutia as president-elect, Argentina was expelled from Venezuela. Our embassy, where the asylum seekers remained, was subject to a permanent siege. Despite these pressures, the Argentine Republic maintained its unwavering conviction to continue denouncing the situation in Venezuela and to act in every available international forum so that Venezuela could once again embrace freedom and democracy. Mr. President, this is not the first time that Argentina has addressed the Security Council regarding the situation in Venezuela. On the 23rd of December last, we expressed our deep concern over institutional and humanitarian deteriorating situation, noting the effects of the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro transcended the domestic sphere and negatively affected regional stability, constituting a concrete threat to hemispheric security. In the same vein, President Milei stated at the Mercosur summit that Argentina welcomed the pressure from the United States aimed at freeing the Venezuelan people.
Hoy, la comunidad
Today, the
internacional se
international
encuentra ante un
community
nuevo
faces a
escenario
new
que
scenario
plantea un doble
that poses
desafío:
a dual challenge
acompañar
to
una transición
support a
democrática
genuine
genuina en
democratic
Venezuela
transition in
y
Venezuela
contribuir al
and to
restablecimiento
contribute
duradero de la
to
paz
the
y la
lasting
seguridad en
restoration
nuestra
of
región.
peace and security in our region.
Frente a ambos desafíos,
Faced with
la
both
República Argentina
challenges, the
está lista y
Argentine
dispuesta a
Republic
colaborar.
stands ready and willing to
Reafirmamos nuestro
cooperate.
firme
We
compromiso
reaffirm
con el
our
pleno
firm
retorno
commitment
de
to
la
the full restoration
institucionalidad
of
y del Estado
institutional
de Derecho en
normalcy and
Venezuela,
the rule of law in
velando en
Venezuela,
todo momento por la
always
libertad, la
safeguarding the
dignidad
freedom,
humana
human
y la
dignity, and
prosperidad
prosperity
del hermano
of
pueblo
the brotherly
venezolano,
Venezuelan
así como
people,
nuestra
as well as our
determinación de
determination
continuar
to
luchando
continue
contra el
fighting against
flagelo
the
del
scourge of
narcoterrorismo y de quienes
narco-terrorism and
contribuyen
those who
a su
contribute to
financiamiento.
its financing.
El proceso que hoy se
The
inicia
process that
requiere el
begins today
compromiso
requires
firme
the
y
firm and
coordinado
coordinated
de todos
commitment
aquellos
of all those
países que han
countries
acompañado al
that
pueblo
have
venezolano en su
accompanied
larga
the
lucha,
Venezuelan people in their
para que
long struggle,
Venezuela pueda
so that
dejar atrás más
Venezuela
de 2
can
décadas
leave
de crisis
behind more than
política,
2 decades
humanitaria y
of political,
social, y
humanitarian,
pueda
and social
finalmente
crisis,
reencontrarse con
and
la
can
libertad,
finally be
la democracia,
reunited with
el
freedom,
respeto a los derechos
democracy, respect
humanos
for
y
human
la
rights,
prosperidad
and
económica.
economic prosperity.
Señor
Mr.
Presidente,
President,
finalmente,
finally,
la República Argentina
the
solicita
Argentine
que las
Republic
autoridades
requests that the
encargadas de
authorities
administrar la transición en
responsible for
Venezuela
administering the transition in
contribuyan a la
Venezuela
inmediata liberación
contribute
del
to the
ciudadano
immediate
argentino
release
Nahuel Gallo,
of the Argentine
quien se
citizen
encuentra en
Nahuel
situación de
Gallo,
desaparición
who has been in a
forzada
situation of
desde el
enforced
8 de
disappearance
diciembre de
since the 8th of
2024,
December
en
2024,
clara
in
violación de
clear
sus derechos
violation
humanos,
of his
y
human
que se
rights,
garantice su
and
pronto
that
y
his
seguro
prompt and safe
retorno a
return to
nuestro
our
país.
country be
Muchas gracias.
guaranteed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Argentina and now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr.
Chile agradece a
President.
Somalia por
Chile
la
would like to
convocatoria de
thank
esta
Somalia
sesión
for convening
informativa
this
abierta bajo el punto del orden
informational
del
briefing
día, amenazas a
under
la paz y la
the
seguridad
item threat
internacional.
to international peace and
Agradecemos
security.
asimismo la
We'd
intervención de la
also
señora
like
Rosemary
to
Di
thank
Carlo, secretaria
Madam
general
Rosemary
adjunta
DiCarlo,
de Asuntos Críticos y
USG
de
for
Consolidación
Political
de la
and
Paz,
Peace Building
así
Affairs,
como las
as
presentaciones
well
del
as
profesor
the
Jeffrey
briefings
Sachs
from
y de la
Mr.
señora
Jeffrey Sachs
Mercedes de
and
Freitas.
Ms. Mercedes de
Señor
Freitas.
presidente, Chile desea expresar su
President,
profunda
Chile would like to
preocupación
express our
y
deep
firme
concern
condena
and
por
firm
las acciones
condemnation
militares
of the
unilaterales de los Estados
unilateral
Unidos
military
sobre el
action taken
territorio
by
de la
the United
República
States in the
Bolivariana de
territory
Venezuela.
of the Bolivarian Republic of
Asimismo,
Venezuela.
reiteramos
We also
consistentemente
reiterate
nuestro firme
consistently our
compromiso con el
firm
respeto al
commitment
derecho
to
internacional,
respect for
la
international
soberanía y la
law,
integridad
sovereignty
territorial,
and
la
territorial
solución
integrity of
pacífica de las
states and the peaceful
controversias,
settlement
la
of
prohibición
disputes,
de la
the
amenaza o el uso de
prohibition
la
of the
fuerza
threat
y
or
el
the
pleno
use of the
respeto de
threat
los
of
derechos
force and
humanos.
full respect for human
Estas
rights.
afirmaciones están
These
aceptadas por la mayoría de
affirmations
los
are
discursos
accepted by
y aunque repetidas, no pueden
the
perder su
majority,
profundo valor
and they
para garantizar la paz y la seguridad
must maintain
internacional.
their importance in order to
Ya
preserve
lo
international
dijimos en
peace and
nuestra
security.
intervención del
We
23
said
de
this on the
diciembre
23rd
y
of
lo
December when we
reiteramos
took the
hoy.
floor, and we
Chile
reiterate
no
this today.
reconoce
Chile does
el
not
régimen de Maduro,
recognize the Maduro
pero las graves
regime,
violaciones a los
but
derechos humanos que
serious
enfrenta
violations
Venezuela
of human
no
rights being
tienen una
faced by
solución
Venezuela
militar
do not have a
y solo
military
pueden
solution.
abordarse
They can
mediante
only
procesos
be addressed
pacíficos,
through
graduales
peaceful,
e
gradual
inclusivos
and
que
inclusive
consideren las
measures that
legítimas
will
aspiraciones
take into
del
account
pueblo
the
venezolano.
legitimate aspirations of the
El
Venezuelan
respeto del
people.
derecho internacional
Respect for
no
international
admite
law
excepciones,
does not allow for
incluso cuando se
exceptions,
trata de
including
abordar la
when it comes
ilegitimidad
to
de un
addressing the
presidente.
illegitimacy
Los
of
problemas
a
deben
president.
resolverse
Problems
siempre
must
dentro
always
del
be
marco
solved
normativo
within
que
the
como
normative
naciones nos
framework
hemos dado.
that we have
El
provided
futuro de
for ourselves
Venezuela
as
debe
nations. The
construirse
future of
con elecciones
Venezuela
libres,
must include
participación
free
ciudadana
elections,
y
citizen
acompañamiento
participation,
internacional,
and
y no
international
con acciones que
assistance, and
puedan
not with
abrir
actions
precedentes
that could
peligrosos
create
o escalar
dangerous
tensiones
precedents or
en la región
escalate
con
tensions
consecuencias
in the
graves
region with
para la
serious
población.
consequences for the population.
Chile, como testigo
Chile,
de la historia,
as a witness
desde su
of
propia
history and
experiencia en la
based
pérdida
on
de la
our
democracia,
own
ha
experience with the loss of democracy, where there was foreign interference that caused extreme damage and pain for the Chilean people. We were able to recover our democracy through a transitional process that was carried out with the assistance of the international community, the strength of organized citizens, and through our institutions. Mr. President, Chile would like also to underscore the urgent need to continue with coordinated efforts multilaterally to address transnational organized crime, and we're also convinced that Latin America and the Caribbean must continue to be a zone of peace, because that zone of peace not only serves Latin America and the Caribbean, but the entire world. An armed conflict will have devastating humanitarian consequences in Venezuela and in the region. It will worsen the suffering of the
y
civilian
agravaría aún
population
más las
and worsen
dinámicas de
even
desplazamiento,
further the
inseguridad y
displacement,
vulnerabilidad.
insecurity and vulnerability aspects
Reiteramos,
of the
cualquier
situation.
diferencia
We
debe abordarse
reiterate that any
exclusivamente a través de
differences
medios
must be dealt
pacíficos,
with
en estricto
exclusively
respeto
through
del derecho
peaceful means,
internacional,
in strict
la
respect for
soberanía de los
international law, the
estados y
sovereignty
la
of states,
prohibición
and
del
the
uso o la
prohibition of
amenaza
the
del
use or
uso
the
de la
threat of the
fuerza.
use of force.
Como fue recientemente
As
señalado
was
por los
recently
jefes de Estado de
indicated by
Brasil,
the
Chile,
heads
Colombia,
of state of
México,
Brazil, Chile,
Uruguay y España,
Mexico, Uruguay, and
manifestamos
Spain,
nuestra preocupación
we
ante
express
cualquier
our
intento
concern with
de
regard to
control
any
gubernamental,
attempt to
de administración o
control
apropiación
government administration
externa
or
de
foreign
recursos naturales y estratégicos,
ownership
lo
of
que resulta incompatible con el
strategic
derecho
assets.
internacional
This would be
y
against
amenaza a la
international law
estabilidad
and would
política,
threaten the
económica y
political,
social de la
economic, and
región.
social stability of the region.
Señor presidente,
Mr.
frente a
President,
este escenario complejo,
given this
Chile
complex
considera valioso
scenario,
el papel que pueden
Chile
desempeñar los mecanismos
welcomes
multilaterales de
the role
diálogo
that
y
could be
prevención.
played
En
by
ese espíritu,
multilateral
vemos con especial
fora,
atención
and
el
here
rol de Naciones
particularly
Unidas,
we
y
would
en
refer to the
particular
role of the
el
United
papel que
Nations
puede
and particularly
jugar
the
el
role that could be
secretario
played by
general
the
y
Secretary
este
General
Consejo,
and by this
con el
Council,
consentimiento de las partes
with the
pertinentes
consent of
para
the
contribuir
parties
a la
involved
reducción
to
de
contribute
tensiones
to
y a la búsqueda de
de-escalating the
entendimientos
situation
que
and searching
favorezcan
for
una
an
salida
understanding
pacífica
that would
y
favor a
sostenible.
peaceful and lasting
El
exit
liderazgo
to the
prudente
crisis.
y la experiencia acumulada
Prudent
por nuestra
leadership
organización,
and experience
así
of
como
our
los mecanismos
organization, as well
regionales,
as the
pueden ser un
regional
apoyo relevante para
organizations and
evitar
mechanisms, could
un
be very
mayor
relevant
deterioro
to
de la
avoid a
situación
further
y
worsening
para
of
mantener
the
abiertos los
situation and to
canales de
keep open
comunicación.
the
Señor presidente,
channels
Chile
of
reitera su
communication. Chile
disposición
reiterates
a
its
respaldar iniciativas
preparedness to
constructivas
support
que
constructive
apunten en esa
initiatives
dirección
that
y a
will
trabajar
point in this
junto a los
direction and
países de la
work together
región
with
y a la
countries of the
comunidad
region and with the
internacional
international
en favor de la
community
estabilidad, el
for
entendimiento
stability
mutuo
and
y el
mutual
respeto de los
understanding and
principios que
respect for the
sustentan esta
principles
organización.
that
Muchas gracias.
underpin this organization. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Chile for the statement and now give the floor to the representatives of Brazil.
Señor presidente, Brasil le agradece a la presidencia
Mr. President,
somalí
we'd
la
like
convocatoria
to
de esta
thank
sesión de
Somalia
emergencia
for convening this
del Consejo de
emergency
Seguridad.
session of the Security
Brasil
Council.
rechaza de manera
Brazil
categórica y con la mayor
categorically and
firmeza
firmly
la
rejects the
intervención armada en
armed
territorio
intervention
venezolano
in Venezuelan
en flagrante
territory
violación de la
in
Carta de las
flagrant
Naciones
violation
Unidas
of the
y del
Charter of the
derecho
United
internacional.
Nations and of
Los
international
bombardeos en
law.
territorio
The
venezolano y la
bombings on
captura de su
Venezuelan territory
presidente
and the capture of
traspasan
its
una línea
president
Estos
cross an
actos
unacceptable
constituyen
line.
una
These acts
gravísima afrenta a
constitute
la
a
soberanía de
very serious
Venezuela
affront to
y
the sovereignty
sientan
of
un
Venezuela
precedente
and set
extremadamente
an extremely
peligroso
dangerous
para toda
precedent
la
for the
comunidad
entire
internacional.
international community.
La Carta de las
The
Naciones
Charter of
Unidas
the United
establece
Nations
como pilar del
establishes as a
orden
pillar of
internacional
the international
la
order
prohibición del
the
uso de la
prohibition
fuerza
of the use
contra la
of force
integridad
against the territorial
o la
integrity or
independencia
political
política de
independence
cualquier
of
Estado,
any state,
salvo en las
except in the
circunstancias
circumstances strictly
estrictamente
provided
previstas en
for
ella.
therein.
La aceptación de
The
acciones de esta
acceptance of
naturaleza
actions of this nature
conduciría
would
inexorablemente a un escenario
inexorably
marcado por la
lead to a
violencia,
scenario
el
marked by
desorden
violence,
y la erosión del
disorder, and the
multilateralismo,
erosion of
en detrimento
multilateralism,
del derecho y
to
de
the
las
detriment of
instituciones
international law
internacionales.
and institutions.
Los efectos del
The
debilitamiento de
effects
los
of the
mecanismos de
weakening of
gobernanza
international
y cooperación
governance and
internacionales
cooperation
ya
mechanisms
son
are
evidentes.
already evident.
El número
The record
desde la
number
Segunda
since
Guerra
the Second
Mundial
World
de
War
61
of
conflictos
61
armados
active
activos.
armed
Las
conflicts,
cifras sin
the
precedentes de
unprecedented figure of
117 millones de
117
personas
million
en
people in
situación de
situations
catástrofe
of
humanitaria en todo el
humanitarian
mundo,
disaster
reflejando
around
el
the
aumento
world,
de guerras,
reflecting the
desplazamientos y
increase in
crímenes
wars,
contra la humanidad,
displacement, and crimes
como el
against
genocidio en
humanity,
Gaza,
such as the
y el
genocide in
incremento
Gaza,
global de
and the
gastos
global
militares
increase in
que se
military spending,
aproxima a
which
la
is
marca
approaching the
histórica de
historical mark of
$2.7 billones
$2.7 trillion.
Tal como Brasil ha sostenido
As
en
Brazil has
reiteradas
reiterated
oportunidades,
on numerous
las normas que
occasions,
rigen la
the
convivencia
norms
entre
that
los
govern
estados son obligatorias
coexistence among
y
states are
universales.
mandatory and universal.
No admiten
They
excepciones
do not
basadas en
admit
intereses
exceptions
o
based on
proyectos
ideological,
ideológicos,
geopolitical,
geopolíticos, políticos
political, economic, or any other kind of interests
No
or
admiten
projects.
que la
They
explotación
do
de
not
recursos
admit that the
naturales
exploitation
o
of natural
económicos
or economic
justifique el
resources
uso de la fuerza
justifies
o
the
el
use of
cambio
force
ilegal
or
de
the
un
illegal
gobierno.
change of a government.
Un mundo multipolar
The
en el siglo
multipolar world of the
XXI que
21st
promueva la
century,
paz
which
y la
promotes
prosperidad
peace and
no se
prosperity,
confunde con
must
áreas
not be
de
confused
influencia.
with spheres of
No
influence.
podemos aceptar el
We cannot
argumento de que el
accept the
fin
argument
justifica
that
los
the end
medios.
justifies the
Este
means.
razonamiento carece
This
de
reasoning
legitimidad
lacks
y
legitimacy
abre la
and
posibilidad de
opens the
otorgar a los más
possibility of
fuertes el
granting
derecho
the
de definir
strongest the
qué es
right to
justo o
define what is
injusto,
just or
qué es
unjust,
correcto
what
o
is right or
incorrecto,
wrong,
e incluso de
and
ignorar
even
las
to
soberanías
ignore
nacionales,
national
imponiendo
sovereignties,
las decisiones que
imposing the
deben adoptar
decisions
los más
to
débiles.
be taken by the weakest.
América Latina y el Caribe han hecho de
Latin
la
America
paz una
and the
elección
Caribbean have made
consciente,
peace a
duradera
conscious,
e
lasting, and
irreversible.
irreversible
El
choice.
recurso a la fuerza en
The
nuestra región
resort to force in our
evoca
region
capítulos de
evokes
la
chapters
historia
of
que
history
creíamos
that we
superados
believed we'd
y
left
pone en
behind
riesgo el
us
esfuerzo
and
colectivo por
endangers the
preservar la
collective
región
effort
como
to
una zona de
preserve the
paz
region
y
as a zone of
cooperación
peace and
libre de
cooperation,
conflictos armados,
free of
respetuosa del
armed
derecho
conflicts,
internacional
respectful
y
of
del
international
principio de no
law and the
injerencia.
principle of non-intervention.
Las intervenciones armadas del
Armed
pasado han
interventions in
tenido
the past
consecuencias
have had
profundamente
profoundly
negativas
negative and lasting
y duraderas.
consequences.
Al contrario de la libertad y
Contrary
de la
to
democracia,
freedom and
esas
democracy,
intervenciones
those
produjeron
interventions
regímenes
produced
autoritarios
authoritarian
y graves
regimes and
violaciones de los
serious
derechos
violations
humanos,
of human
dejando
rights,
como saldo
leaving as
lamentable
a
miles de
lamentable
muertos,
result
presos
thousands of
políticos,
dead,
torturados y
political
personas
prisoners,
desaparecidas,
tortured
cuyos
persons,
familiares
and
aún hoy
disappeared persons whose
buscan a
families
sus
still
entes
today
queridos, además de
search for
justicia y
their loved
reparación.
ones as well as justice and
Por primera vez en
reparation.
América del Sur
For
se
the
ha
first
producido
time in
un hecho
South America, a
profundamente
profoundly
alarmante,
alarming event has occurred.
una agresión armada
An
externa
external armed
con el despliegue
aggression
de
with
tropas y
the deployment
bombardeos
of troops
en un
and
país
bombings in a
vecino
neighboring
contiguo de
country
Brasil, con
contiguous
el que
with Brazil,
compartimos más de
with which we
2.000
share more
kilómetros
than
de frontera.
2,000 kilometers of border.
Señor presidente, América del
Mr.
Sur es una
President, South
zona de
America
paz,
is a zone of
insisto.
peace. I insist
Hemos
upon
sostenido y
that. We have
sostendremos con
upheld
toda
and will
determinación
uphold
la paz
with full
y la no
determination
intervención
peace
en
and
nuestro entorno.
non-intervention in
Además,
our
Brasil no cree
region.
que la solución de
Furthermore,
la
Brazil does
situación
not
en
believe
Venezuela
that the solution
pase
to the
por la
situation in
creación de
Venezuela lies in the
protectorados en el
creation of
país, sino
protectorates in the
por
country,
soluciones que
but
respeten la
rather in
autodeterminación del
solutions that
pueblo
respect the
venezolano en
self-determination
el
of the
marco de su
Venezuelan people
constitución.
within the framework of its
Los hechos del
constitution.
3 de enero trascienden
The
el
events
ámbito
of January
regional.
3rd
El
transcend the
atentado
regional
contra la
sphere.
soberanía de
The
cualquier
attack on the
país,
sovereignty of any country,
independientemente de la orientación
regardless
de
of
su
the
gobierno,
direction of its
afecta a toda
government,
la
affects
comunidad
the
internacional.
entire international community.
Este y otros casos de
This and other
intervención armada
cases of
contra la
armed
soberanía
intervention
de un
against the
país,
sovereignty of a
su
country,
integridad
its
territorial,
territorial
con sus
integrity or its
instituciones,
institutions
deben ser
must
condenados con vehemencia.
be vehemently
Corresponde a este
condemned.
Consejo
It is up
asumir
to
su
this Council to
responsabilidad
assume its
y
responsibility
reaccionar con
and react
determinación,
with determination,
claridad y
clarity,
obediencia al derecho
and
internacional
obedience to
a fin de
international
evitar
law
que la ley
in
de la
order to
fuerza
prevent the law of
prevalezca
force
sobre
from
la fuerza de
prevailing
la ley.
over the force of
Brasil
law.
confía en que el futuro de Venezuela
Brazil
se
trusts that the
construya
future of
por el pueblo
Venezuela will be built by
venezolano
the
a
Venezuelan
través del
people through
diálogo,
dialogue,
sin
without
injerencias
external
externas
interference,
y en
and
el
within
marco del
the
derecho
framework
internacional.
of
Muchas gracias.
international law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
gracias por haber convocado
thank you for
a esta reunión
having
de emergencia del
convened
Consejo.
this emergency meeting of the
El
Council.
gobierno de México ha hecho
The government of
explícita
Mexico
ya
has already
su posición de
made
condena
its position
a la
clear with
agresión
regard to our
militar
condemnation
del
of the
pasado 3
military
de
aggression
enero
of January
contra
3rd
objetivos en
against
territorio de
targets in
Venezuela
the territory of
en
Venezuela
clara
in
violación
clear
del
violation of
artículo
Article
segundo
2
de la
of
Carta
the
de las
Charter
Naciones
of the
Unidas.
United Nations.
Estas acciones
These
no
actions
deben
must not
permitirse,
be
pues
allowed
constituyen
as they
un severo
constitute
golpe
a severe
a
blow
la Carta
to the
y al
Charter
multilateralismo.
and to multilateralism.
México quisiera
Mexico would
precisar
like to
los
clarify the
siguientes
following
4
points.
puntos.
4 points.
Número 1. La
Number 1,
proscripción
the
de la
prohibition
amenaza
of the threat
y el uso de la
or
fuerza
the use of
contra la
force
soberanía,
against the
la
sovereignty,
integridad
territorial
territorial
integrity,
o la
or
independencia
political
política
independence
de todo
of
Estado
any state
es el
is
fundamento
the
del derecho
foundation
internacional,
of international law,
sin importar el
regardless
país
of the
o el
country
gobierno de que
or
se
the
trate.
government involved.
2. La
2.
retórica que apunta
Rhetoric
hacia un
pointing
escalamiento
towards the
o
escalation
expansión
or
de las
expansion
acciones
of
militares,
military actions,
incluidos otros
including
países de
to
nuestra
other
región,
countries in our region,
amenaza la
threatens
estabilidad
regional
regional.
stability.
3.
3.
El Consejo de
The
Seguridad
Security Council
tiene la
has the
responsabilidad
responsibility
y sobre todo
and, above
la
all, it has
obligación
the
de
obligation
actuar de
to
manera
act
decisiva
decisively
y sin
and
dobles
without
estándares
double double standards
ante violaciones
in
graves a la
face of
Carta
serious
y para
violations of
restablecer
the Charter
la paz y la
and
seguridad
to restore international
internacionales
peace and
en
security
estricto
in
apego
strict adherence
a lo
to the
dispuesto en
provisions
su artículo
of Article 24
y
and
observando
observing
el
Article
artículo
27.3.
27, inciso 3. 4. Corresponde a los
It
pueblos
is for
soberanos
sovereign peoples
decidir su
to
destino
decide their
y
destiny
encontrar
and to
soluciones
find
pacíficas,
peaceful,
democráticas y
democratic,
negociadas
and
a
negotiated
sus diferencias
solutions to their
políticas
political
en
differences
un marco de
within a
irrestricto
framework
respeto
of
a los derechos
unrestricted
humanos.
respect for human rights.
Los cambios de régimen
Regime
por
change
actores
by
externos
external
y la
actors
aplicación de medidas
and the application of
extraterritoriales
extraterritorial
no
measures
solo son actos
are not only
contrarios al
acts
derecho
contrary to
internacional,
international law,
sino que
but
históricamente
historically,
han
all
agudizado
they've done is
conflictos
exacerbate
y
conflicts
fragilizado
and
el
weakened
tejido
the
social
social
y
and
político
political
de las naciones.
fabric of nations.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
estimados colegas,
esteemed colleagues,
estimadas colegas, a pesar de las diferencias políticas
despite the
entre
political
nuestros
differences
gobiernos,
among our governments,
América Latina y el
Latin
Caribe
America and the
se ha
Caribbean
forjado
has
como
been
una zona de paz.
forged as a zone of peace.
Colectivamente hemos
Collectively,
recurrido
we
durante
have,
décadas
for
ya
decades now,
a los
resorted
mecanismos
to the
políticos y
available
jurídicos
political
disponibles
and legal
de
mechanisms
solución de
available
controversias.
in order to peacefully settle
La
disputes.
violación actual
The current
de este frágil
violation of this
equilibrio
fragile
pone
balance
en grave
gravely
riesgo
endangers
la estabilidad
the political
política
stability
y la
and
seguridad de la
the
región,
security of the region,
así como el
as well
bienestar
as the
de
well-being
nuestros pueblos.
of our peoples.
Quienes justifican
Those who
estos
justify
actos
these acts
niegan la
deny the
historia
independent
independiente
history
de América
of
Latina
Latin
y el
America
Caribe.
and the Caribbean.
México,
Mexico,
firme en sus
firm
principios
in its
constitucionales de
constitutional
política exterior
principles of foreign
y
policy
su vocación
and its
pacifista,
pacifist
reitera
calling,
enfáticamente
emphatically
que el
reiterates
diálogo y la
that
negociación
dialogue and
son las
negotiation
únicas vías
are the
legítimas
only
y
legitimate
eficaces
and effective
para
ways
resolver
to
las
resolve
diferencias existentes.
existing differences.
Reitero
I
el llamado
reiterate
de la
the call
presidenta
of
de
the
México
President of Mexico
a que la ONU
for
haga
the
más
UN
por
to
solucionar
do
este
more
y
to
otros
resolve this
conflictos,
and other conflicts,
incluyendo a
including
través de
through the
gestiones
good
de su
offices of
secretario
its
general.
Secretary General.
Frente a los acontecimientos
In
del
view
pasado
of
3
the
de
events
enero,
of January 3rd,
México refrenda
Mexico
su disposición
reaffirms
de
its
apoyar
willingness to
cualquier
support
esfuerzo de
any effort
facilitación del
at
diálogo,
facilitating
mediación
dialogue,
o acompañamiento
mediation, or
que
providing
promueva
assistance
la paz en
that
la
promotes peace in the region.
Finalmente,
Finally,
no podemos pasar
we
por alto
cannot overlook
que
the
esta
fact
sesión del
that this
Consejo
session of the
se haya
Council
celebrado
has
hasta hoy,
been held only
cuando lo que
now,
tenemos ante
when what
nosotros
we
es
face
una grave
is a serious
situación que
situation
pone en
that
riesgo
puts
la paz
international
y la
peace
seguridad
and security
internacional.
at risk.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Paraguay.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
La delegación de la República del Paraguay
The
agradece a
delegation
la
of
presidencia
Paraguay
y a
would
los
like to
miembros
thank
del
the presidency and the
Consejo por
members
la
of the
oportunidad
Council
de
for the
tomar la palabra
opportunity
en
to
esta
take the
sesión
floor
de
at
fundamental
this
relevancia.
very
El Paraguay
important
ha
session.
alertado sobre la deriva
Paraguay
insostenible
has already
de
pointed
Venezuela
out
bajo el mando de Nicolás Maduro,
the situation with regard to
cabecilla del
Venezuela
cartel
under
de los
President
soles,
Maduro and the
estructura criminal
Cartel de los
declarada
Soles and the
formalmente
criminal
como
organization that
terrorista
was
por
formally
las
declared as
autoridades
such by
nacionales y cuya persistencia
our
en el
national
poder
authorities,
representaba
and
una amenaza
his
para la
continued
región.
presence was a threat
La
to the
salida del
region.
líder de dicha
The exit of the leader
organización
of that
terrorista
terrorist
debe abrir paso de
organization should
inmediato a la
immediately
restauración de
lead
la
to the
democracia
restoration
y del
of
Estado de
democracy
Derecho en
and to
Venezuela,
the rule of law in
permitiendo que la
Venezuela,
voluntad
making
popular
it possible
expresada
for the
en las
popular
urnas
will
sea el
expressed
único motor de la
at the ballot
reconstrucción
box will
venezolana.
be the foundation for reconstruction in
En este sentido,
Venezuela.
hacemos también un enérgico llamado a
We
la
would also
pronta
urgently
liberación de
call
todos
for
los presos
the
políticos
release of all
que aún se
political
encuentran
prisoners
dentro de
that
las
are
cárceles
still
de ese
in
país.
the prisons of that
Reiteramos
country,
que el
and we
retorno a la
reiterate that a
institucionalidad
return
democrática
to
en Venezuela
democratic
y la posibilidad
institutions in
de que las
Venezuela,
autoridades
and the
legítimamente
possibility for
electas
the
asuman
legitimately
sus
elected
funciones
authorities to
constituyen
resume their
pasos
functions are
fundamentales para
fundamental
la
steps
estabilidad
for
de la región.
for stability in the
Finalmente,
region.
el Paraguay
And finally,
reafirma su
Paraguay
compromiso
reaffirms
histórico
our
con la
historic
resolución
commitment
pacífica
to
de
the
las
peaceful settlement
controversias,
of disputes,
observa con atención
and
el
we
desarrollo de los acontecimientos
observe
actuales
the
en
current
Venezuela
events in
y
Venezuela,
alienta a priorizar
and
vías
we would
democráticas que
urge
garanticen una
democratic means to be given
transición ordenada.
priority for a
Nuestro
ordered
compromiso es y
transition.
seguirá
Our
siendo con los
commitment will
principios
continue to be to the
democráticos del
democratic
Estado de Derecho
principles of
y
the
la
rule
paz
of law
social.
and
Muchas gracias,
peace in
señor
society. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Paraguay for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you,
Señor
Mr. President. Mr.
Cuba se adhiere
President,
a las intervenciones que
Cuba
realizarán Eritrea
aligns
en
itself
nombre del
with
grupo de
the
amigos en
statement to be
defensa de la Carta de las
delivered by
Naciones
Eritrea
Unidas
on behalf of the
y
group of
Uganda
friends
en
of the
nombre del
United Nations
movimiento
and
de países
Uganda
no
on behalf
alineados.
of the non-aligned
Desde
movement.
septiembre del pasado
Since
año,
September of last
Cuba ha
year,
venido
Cuba has been
denunciando los planes
denouncing the
hegemónicos y criminales
hegemonic
de
and
Estados
criminal
Unidos
plans of the
y
United
su proyección
States
agresiva contra
and
Venezuela
its
y la región. Hemos expuesto con
aggressive
claridad
projection
las
against
graves e
Venezuela and the
impredecibles
region.
consecuencias de la
We have
conducta irresponsable
clearly
del
been
gobierno de
exposed
Estados
to the
Unidos
serious and unpredictable
para la estabilidad
consequences of the
política,
irresponsible
social
conduct
y
of the US
económica de
government
América Latina y el
for the
Caribe
political,
y en
social, and
sentido
economic
general
stability of
para
Latin
la
America
paz
and
y
the Caribbean,
estabilidad
and more generally
internacionales.
for international peace
El
and
pasado
stability.
23 de diciembre
On the 23rd of
expusimos en
December,
este mismo
in
órgano
this very body,
la secuencia y la escalada
we
de
set
acciones
out the
llevadas a cabo
sequence and
por Estados Unidos
escalation
en tiempo
of
récord
actions carried out
con
by
el
the
fin de
United
derrocar por
States
la fuerza al gobierno
with the aim
legítimo
of
y constitucional
overthrowing by
de
force the
Venezuela
legitimate
y
and
acabar con la
constitutional
Unión
government of
Cívico-Militar.
Venezuela and destroying the
Estados
civic and
Unidos
military
acudió a
union.
diversas
The
maniobras
United
para
States
materializar
resorted to various
sus planes de
maneuvers to
dominación,
materialize its plans for
incluidos viles
domination,
ejecuciones
including
extrajudiciales y
vile
actos de piratería, el
extrajudicial
terrorismo marítimo
executions
contra buques
and acts
petroleros
of
y sus
piracy,
tripulaciones en
maritime
aguas
terrorism
internacionales
against
del
oil
Mar Caribe,
tankers and their crews in
así como a la
international
imposición
waters
de
of
un
the
ilegal
Caribbean
bloqueo
Sea,
naval
as well as
contra
the imposition
Venezuela
of an
y
illegal
a la
naval
designación
blockade against
políticamente
Venezuela
motivada
and the
de su
politically
gobierno legítimo
motivated
como
designation of
organización
its legitimate
terrorista
government as a
extranjera.
foreign terrorist organization.
Previamente había sometido a ese
Previously,
país
it had
a
subjected that
prolongadas
country
medidas
to
coercitivas
prolonged
unilaterales,
unilateral coercive
asfixia
measures,
económica,
economic
campañas de descrédito y ataques contra
asphyxiation,
algunas de sus
smear
importantes
campaigns, and
instituciones,
attacks against some of its
exponiéndolo a una guerra psicológica
important
atroz.
institutions, exposing it to a cruel
Con un
psychological
irrespeto
war.
absoluto a la Carta
With
de las
absolute
Naciones Unidas y el
disrespect
derecho
for the Charter of the
internacional,
United Nations and
incluidas
international law,
relevantes
including
resoluciones adoptadas
relevant
por este
resolutions
Consejo
adopted by this
y por la
Council and
Asamblea
by the
General.
General Assembly.
Este 3 de enero,
On
las
January
fuerzas
the
militares
3rd, United
estadounidenses
States military
atacaron
forces
con total
attacked
brutalidad y
Venezuela
alevosía
with
a
total
Venezuela.
brutality and
Y en
treachery.
un acto inaceptable y
And
bárbaro,
in an unacceptable and
secuestraron a su
barbaric
legítimo
act,
presidente
kidnapped
Nicolás
its
Maduro
legitimate
y
president,
su
Nicolas
compañera
Maduro, and
Cilia
his
Flores.
companion, Celia Flores.
Cuba condena en los términos
Cuba
más genéricos
condemns in the
la
strongest
agresión militar
terms
de
the
Estados
military
Unidos
aggression
contra
of the
Venezuela,
United States
a
against
la vez que
Venezuela,
reitera de forma
while
categórica
categorically
su absoluto
reiterating
respaldo y
its absolute
solidaridad
support
con
and
el pueblo y
solidarity
gobierno
with the
venezolanos
Venezuelan
y
people,
se suma al reclamo para que el
and
gobierno de Estados Unidos
joins the
libere al
demand that the
presidente
government of the United
constitucional Nicolás
States
Maduro
release the
Moros y la
constitutional
compañera
president,
Cilia
Nicolas
Flores.
Maduro Moros, and his companion,
En
Celia
el
Flores.
criminal ataque
In the
perpetrado por Estados
criminal
Unidos,
attack perpetrated by
perdieron
the
la vida en
United
acciones
States,
combativas 32 cubanos,
32
quienes
Cubans
cumplían
lost
misiones
their
en
lives in
representación de las
combat
Fuerzas Armadas
actions. They
Revolucionarias
were carrying
y
out
el
missions on
Ministerio del
behalf of the
Interior, a
Revolutionary Armed
solicitud de
Forces and the
órganos
Ministry of the
homólogos de ese
Interior
país.
at the request of
Nuestros
counterpart bodies
compatriotas
of that
cumplieron
country.
dignamente con su
Our
deber
compatriots
y
honorably
cayeron
fulfilled their
tras feria
duty and fell
resistencia
after fierce
en combate
resistance
directo
in
contra los
direct
atacantes
combat
o como
against
resultado de
the
los
attackers
bombardeos
or
a
as
las
a result of
instalaciones.
the bombings of the
Supieron poner
facilities.
en alto con su actuación
Through
heroica
their
los
heroic
sentimientos
actions, they
solidarios de
upheld the
millones de compatriotas.
solidarity sentiments of millions of
Señor
our
presidente,
compatriots.
la
Mr.
cobarde
President,
agresión
the
estadounidense
cowardly
contra
U.S.
Venezuela
aggression against
es un acto
Venezuela is a
criminal,
criminal act
violatorio del
in
derecho
violation of
internacional y la
international
Carta de la
law
ONU.
and the UN Charter.
Constituye una
It
escalada peligrosa de
constitutes
la
a dangerous
campaña de guerra
escalation of
sostenida
the
durante
sustained
años
war
por Estados
campaign
Unidos
waged for years
contra
by the
esa hermana
United
nación
States against that
que se
sister nation,
intensificó desde
which
septiembre de
intensified since
2025
September
con el despliegue naval
2025
agresivo
with
en
the
el Mar
aggressive
Caribe
naval
bajo
deployment
pretextos
in the Caribbean
mendaces
Sea
y
under
acusaciones
mendacious
infundadas sin
pretexts and unfounded
evidencia alguna.
accusations without any evidence
Señor
whatsoever.
ataque militar de
The
Estados
U.S.
Unidos
military
contra
attack against
Venezuela
Venezuela
no tiene
has
justificación
no
alguna.
justification
No responde a
whatsoever.
ninguna
It does not
provocación,
respond
ni
to any
cuenta con
provocation, nor
legitimidad.
does it possess
Se sustenta
legitimacy.
en la aberrante
It is
doctrina de
based
la
on the
paz por medio de la
aberrant
fuerza
doctrine
y
of peace
quebranta
through
la
force
estabilidad y la
and
paz que ha
undermines the
caracterizado durante
stability
años
and
a
peace
nuestra
that have
región
characterized
latinoamericana
our
y
Latin
caribeña.
American and Caribbean region for
Busca
years.
propiciar un cambio
It
del
seeks to promote a change in the constitutional order of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, freely chosen by its people. Its ultimate objective is not the false narrative of combating drug trafficking, but control over Venezuela's land and natural resources, as has been openly and shamelessly declared by President Trump and his Secretary of State. This is an imperialist and fascist aggression with objectives of domination that seeks to revive the U.S. hegemonic ambitions over our America, anchored in the outdated Monroe Doctrine. It also seeks to intimidate and subjugate the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba calls for an urgent reaction from the international community against this criminal attack on Venezuela, a peaceful nation that does not attack the United States or any other country. We call on all governments, parliaments, social movements, and peoples of the world to condemn the U.S. military aggression against Venezuela and to confront this act of state terrorism that threatens international peace and security and seeks to impose a new doctrine of U.S. imperialist domination in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the world. Mr. President, the recent statements about imperialist plans to steer Venezuela toward a supposed safe, appropriate and prudent transition are totally unacceptable. In the U.S. vision of domination, this means imposing a puppet government functional to its predatory goals, particularly unrestricted access to and plundering of natural resources that, by right, belong to the Venezuelan people. Determining the destiny of Venezuela is an exclusive right of its people, without external interference. If the U.S. government, lacking any moral authority whatsoever, truly cared about the peace, freedom and justice of Venezuelan men and women, it would not have bombed that territory with absolute disregard for the lives, sovereignty and territorial integrity of that nation. I conclude by reaffirming our unwavering adherence to the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, and by calling for action with the firmness and determination that current circumstances demand, always in defense of international law and of the future of peace for all the peoples of our America and of the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Latin America and the Caribbean is a zone of peace, declared by the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, on behalf of all of the peoples and governments of our region. This zone of peace must be fully respected by all governments of the world without exception, and in particular by the members of this Security Council responsible for international peace and security. This decision, these desires and aspirations of our peoples are a noble contribution to world peace, to international law and to the United Nations Charter.
Señor Presidente, Nicaragua respalda lo expresado por la presidenta interina de Venezuela, Delcy Rodríguez, que pide la liberación inmediata del presidente constitucional y legítimo de Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro Moro, y la primera combatiente de la patria, Cilia Flores. Todos los Estados miembros de Naciones Unidas tenemos el deber de respetar el derecho internacional, el espíritu, los propósitos y principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, el derecho a la soberanía, autodeterminación, integridad territorial de los Estados, la no injerencia, la convivencia pacífica. El pueblo venezolano es el pueblo digno de Bolívar, de Chávez, de Maduro, e históricamente indoblegable, que defiende su soberanía y su derecho a la paz. Nicaragua siempre estará con Venezuela. La paz ha sido profundamente herida y la familia humana, la comunidad de naciones, los pueblos del mundo, urgimos que se reinstale como absoluto reflejo de la dignidad de todos los pueblos. Muchas gracias.
Respect the dignity of all peoples. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Nicaragua for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago thanks the Security Council for convening this urgent meeting following the recent developments in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. My delegation addresses this council today as a Caribbean nation, a neighbor of Venezuela, and a long-standing advocate for peaceful coexistence and the rule of law. The government of Trinidad and Tobago has taken note of the military operations undertaken by the United States in Venezuela. We remain committed to cooperative efforts led by the United States to disrupt and dismantle networks that enable transnational crime across the Americas, whose activities have had debilitating effects on the security and stability of the region. Trinidad and Tobago remains steadfast in its support of the United States of America's initiatives that strengthen regional security, reinforce the rule of law, and safeguard the well-being of our societies, the Americas. The government of Trinidad and Tobago, while valuing its long-standing and robust partnership with the United States, remains equally committed to maintaining a constructive and respectful relationship with the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and continues to uphold peaceful relations with the people of Venezuela. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to underscore its long-standing relationship with both the United States and Venezuela, and stands ready to work collaboratively with all partners who share the aspiration of a safer, more prosperous and stable hemisphere. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank the representative of Trinidad and Tobago, and now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Señor presidente, en primer lugar, me gustaría felicitarle por la asunción de la presidencia mensual del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas y desearle todo el éxito en el desempeño de sus funciones. Agradezco la convocatoria de esta importante reunión y también transmito mi agradecimiento a la secretaria general adjunta y jefa del Departamento de Asuntos Políticos y Consolidación de la Paz de las Naciones Unidas, señora Di Carlo, por la información proporcionada en el día de hoy. España expresa su profunda preocupación por lo ocurrido en Venezuela, que, como ha señalado el secretario general de Naciones Unidas, constituye un precedente muy preocupante con implicaciones para la región y para el mundo. El respeto a los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, en particular a la soberanía e integridad territorial de los Estados y a la prohibición del uso y amenaza de la fuerza, es indispensable para garantizar la convivencia internacional. España defiende la vigencia de un orden internacional basado en reglas, donde resulta imperativo apostar, como recoge el artículo 2.3 de la Carta, por el arreglo pacífico de las controversias. Consideramos que estas acciones constituyen un precedente muy preocupante para la paz y la seguridad regional, y recordamos que los recursos naturales del país son parte de su soberanía. Compartimos que la lucha contra el crimen organizado en la región es una prioridad, pero esa lucha solo puede hacerse mediante la cooperación internacional. Compartimos también que es prioritario defender los derechos humanos y las libertades públicas en Venezuela. España quiere trabajar por la paz, la estabilidad, la democracia, el progreso y la justicia social. Y eso no puede venir impuesto por la fuerza. Eso solo puede venir a través de un diálogo extenso entre venezolanos, con una solución venezolana pacífica y democrática, que sea la voz del pueblo venezolano la que marque el destino de Venezuela
that determines the destiny of
España no
Venezuela.
reconoció el resultado de las
Spain
últimas
did not
elecciones celebradas
recognize the
en Venezuela
results
en
of the
julio
most
de
recent elections
2024
held in
y ha
Venezuela
sido
in July
contundente su condena de cualquier
2024
violación y
and has been
amenaza a los derechos
unequivocal in
humanos.
condemning any
Ha
violations
dado
and threats to
protección a
human
aquellos líderes
rights.
opositores que
We've
han sido
provided
perseguidos
protection
y ha
to
mostrado
opposition
un firme
leaders who have
rechazo
been
a cualquier
persecuted
conducta
and have expressed
antidemocrática y
firm
abuso
rejection
contra la
of any
ciudadanía.
undemocratic
Pero
conduct
esta
and
condena
abuses
solo
against
puede
the
ejercerse desde
citizenry.
el respeto
But
a la
such
legalidad
condemnation can only be
internacional.
exercised with full respect for
España
international law.
trabajará por unir a los
Spain
venezolanos
will work to unite
y venezolanas
Venezuelans,
y apuesta por
men
el
and
diálogo y la
women,
paz,
and
porque
is
la fuerza
committed to dialogue
jamás
and peace because
trae
force
más
never
democracia.
brings
Gracias,
more
señor
democracy.
presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Spain, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to congratulate the Federal Republic of Somalia for assuming the rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council for the month of January, and wish you and your delegation all the best in the execution of your responsibilities. We also wish to thank you for convening this debate and affording all UN member states to participate, because the situation in Venezuela concerns all UN member states, given its implications for the credibility of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, integral to the maintenance of international peace and security since the establishment of the United Nations is the understanding that no nation can claim to be legally or morally superior to another. We are all nations born out of different histories and contexts, ascribing to the common values and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Chief amongst these principles is the sovereign equality of all its members. By signing the Charter, we have all committed to settle our international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace, security, and justice are not endangered. We have also committed to refrain in our foreign relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice has also previously affirmed that international law prohibits the use of force and intervention in another state's affairs. Due to the shortcomings of its predecessor, the League of Nations, the UN was created to prevent countries from resorting to conflict, to settle disputes, and prohibit the use of force unless it is done in a legally prescribed manner. In doing so, the UN has played a pivotal role in ensuring peaceful existence amongst nations, including in ending the colonial subjugation by powerful countries over others, underpinned by respect for the equal rights of nations, large and small, and respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Joining the organization and committing to its principles afforded protection to many of us, with the supposed assurance that no longer would one nation be seen as inferior to another. Unfortunately, when countries ignore the Charter and act contrary to its central premise, it undermines the credibility of the entire system in which we all undertake our international relations. The stability of the international system depends not only on the respect, but on the consistent application of these established legal norms. We all benefit from a rules-based international order based on international law. When we break those norms, we invite anarchy and an environment where might makes right, ignoring the complexity of interrelations and interdependence in our modern world. Mr. President, the unilateral military strikes carried out by the United States of America against Venezuela and the abduction of President Nicolas Maduro and his spouse from Venezuelan territory for transfer to the United States wantonly violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence of Venezuela. These actions are also in stark contrast to our established legal norms, reinforcing the belief that might is right and undermining diplomacy. History has repeatedly demonstrated that military invasions against sovereign states yield only instability and deepen crises. Unlawful unilateral force of this nature undermines the stability of the international order and the principle of equality among nations. Such use of force also undermines the institutional infrastructure established to regulate relations among nations. We have seen examples of these in Libya, Iraq, and countless cases in Africa where foreign interventions and interference create security crises and undermine national governance institutions cultivated through nuanced and complex national contexts. South Africa stresses that allegations of internal governance challenges, human rights concerns, or acts of criminality by a head of state cannot justify a breach of the Charter's prohibition on the use of force, particularly Article 2.4 of the Charter. The peaceful resolution of disputes and internal matters must proceed in accordance with international law and through multilateral mechanisms. Additionally, under international law, a state has exclusive jurisdiction over persons and conduct within its own territory. Any enforcement of domestic law, including arrest by one state within the territory of another state without the state's consent, is an unlawful violation of sovereignty. There are recourse mechanisms at the disposal of states to implement international law. This includes taking action by bringing a case before the International Court of Justice or seeking action from the Security Council. We note the statement issued by a group of concerned countries, mainly those in the Latin American region, most affected by the developments in Venezuela, which reiterates that the situation in Venezuela must be resolved exclusively through peaceful means, through dialogue, negotiation, and respect for the will of the Venezuelan people in all its expressions, without external interference and in accordance with international law. Mr. President, each one of our countries, including our peoples, that are members of this organization and that are bound to its charters, have the right to determine our own democratic and political path. This inherent charter-given right to self-determination cannot and should not be abrogated. If we do not stand up for the sovereign rights of any nations or states when they are undermined and wantonly violated, then which one of us are safe or are guaranteed protection by the principles of the Charter and international law? Failure to act decisively against such violations is a tantamount to inviting anarchy and normalizing the use of force and military might as the main form of discourse in international politics. This would be a regression into a world preceding the United Nations, a world that gave us two brutal world wars, and an international system prone to severe structural instability and lawlessness. We cannot afford to proceed into a complex future without the stability and protection afforded by international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the onset to congratulate Your Excellency and the government of the Federal Republic of Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of January. We also extend our congratulations to Bahrain, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, and Latvia on their election to the Security Council. As this is the first Security Council meeting of the year, allow me to pay tribute to the outgoing members, Algeria, Guyana, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, and Slovenia, for their dedicated service and diligent work throughout the tenure of the Council. I read this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations condemns the most unequivocal and categoric manner the act of aggression perpetrated on 3rd January 2026 against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela by special forces of the United States of America, which included armed attacks against civilian and military objects in the capital city of Caracas, as well as in various other cities of the Venezuelan territory, and the illegal abduction of the President and First Lady of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, His Excellency Mr. Nicolas Maduro Moros, and Her Excellency Mrs. Celia Flores de Maduro. The member states of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations expressed their serious concern at the impact of these series of armed attacks, particularly on civilians and their human rights to life, which have included military assaults with U.S. Special Forces, while emphasizing that such acts constitute a clear breach of international law and of each and every principle governing international relations, including those foreseen in the Charter of the United Nations. The Group of Friends of the Charter of the United Nations reiterates its firm support to the constitutional government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela under the leadership of President Nicolas Maduro Moros, and emphasize the importance of ensuring strict respect for the inviolability of the immunities accorded to heads of states and government under international law, while renewing its unwavering solidarity with the Venezuelan people in their ongoing struggle for defending their homeland, including through the actions it may take within the framework of international law to exercise its inalienable right to self-defense. The member states of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations demand for the immediate cessation of all hostilities against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, for the full respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and inalienable right to self-determination of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, for the immediate return of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores de Maduro to the Venezuelan national territory, and for those responsible for these acts of aggression to be held accountable. The Group of Friends of the Charter of the United Nations firmly reject the remarks delivered by the President of the United States of America during the afternoon of 3rd January 2026, in which he not only threatened with additional airstrikes against the Venezuelan territory, but also claimed to resolve to occupy and govern the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and to exploit the natural resources and administer the wealth of that sisterly nation in what can only be described as the confession of a clear plan of annexation that foresees, among others, the complete obliteration of the inalienable rights of the Venezuelan people, as well as the fundamental rights of the Venezuelan state as a whole. The member states of the Group of Friends of the Defense of the Charter of the United Nations call on all relevant international bodies, including the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations, to swiftly mobilize in order to uphold the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, and to urgently take appropriate measures to avoid further escalation of the situation on the ground, particularly additional acts of aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and preserve both regional and international peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Eritrea for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the Compassionate and Merciful, thank you, Mr. President, for convening this emergency and important meeting. We acknowledge the presence of the Undersecretary General Mysticalo at this meeting and extend our appreciation to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his informative and insightful briefing. At the outset, I would like to extend my warm congratulations to Somalia on its assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also wish to warmly congratulate the newly elected members of the Council, Bahrain, Colombia, Republic of Congo, Latvia, and Liberia on their election. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran would like to associate itself with the statement delivered by Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, and wishes to make the following remarks in its national capacity. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran condemns in the strongest possible terms the military attack carried out by the United States of America against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This illegal act constitutes a state terrorism, a manifest violation of Charter of the United Nations, particularly Article 2, Section 4, and Section 7, and peremptory norms of the international law, and amounts to an internationally wrongful act and a full-fledged act of aggression. Such military aggression against an independent member state of the United Nations establishes a serious breach of regional and international peace and security, with far-reaching consequences for the international system as a whole. Second, the abduction of democratically elected president and the First Lady of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela by the United States constitute a flagrant violation of customary international law, including the principles of the inviolability of the immunities accorded to the heads of a state and government under international law, and represent a grave assault on the sovereign equality of states. The Islamic Republic of Iran recalls Venezuela's inherent right to self-defense and underscored the legal responsibility of the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, to take immediate measures to halt this unlawful aggression and to ensure accountability for all those responsible. Iran also affirms its full support for the people and legitimate the elected government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Third, the United States is openly seeking to substitute its domestic law for international law and the Charter of the United Nations. This represents a serious warning to the international community and to all member states. Such unlawful conduct strikes at the very foundations of the Charter-based international legal order and establishes a dangerous precedent that must be categorically and unequivocally rejected. The so-called declared U.S. policy of peace through strength prescribed the law of the jungle and the rule of force instead of rule of law, and if tolerated and normalized, would render the collective security system established by the Charter ineffective and devoid of purpose. Fourth, the continued inaction and paralysis of the Security Council in the face of the explicit threat and act of aggression by the United States have fostered a dangerous climate of impunity. It has emboldened the United States to persist in unlawful conduct that poses a grave threat to regional and international peace and security. In recent days, the President of the United States had repeatedly issued public threat of the use of force against the Islamic Republic of Iran in manifest violation of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations. At the same time, the United States is shedding crocodile tears for the Iranian people and hypocritically claims to support them while maintaining a well-documented record of intervention, the use of force, and the imposition of unlawful unilateral coercive measures against Iran. This includes its direct political, military, and operational support and involvement for Israeli regime unlawful joint war of aggression against Iran between 13 and 24 June 2025, which resulted in loss of civilian life, attacks on civilian infrastructure, and serious violations of fundamental human rights of the Iranian people. Iran reaffirms its inherent right to defend its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national security, and to protect its people against any foreign interference. The United States of America will bear full responsibility for consequences arising from its unlawful threats and any ensuing escalation. Finally, we unequivocally reject the baseless allegation and unwarranted reference made to Iran by the representative of the United States at this meeting. The facts on the ground are clear, speak loudly for themselves, and cannot be concealed by political rhetoric or manufactured narrative. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran and now give the floor to the representative of Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, representing 121 member states united by the shared principle of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. The Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, categorically condemns the act of aggression perpetuated by the United States of America against the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela since the early hours of 3rd January 2026, which included armed attacks against civilian and military locations in the capital city of Caracas, as well as in various other cities of the Venezuelan territory. The Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement notes that attacks in question, which blatantly violate the purposes and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, as well as the norms of the international law, constitute an act of war against the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela that undermines both regional and international peace, security, and stability, while also threatening the very right to life of the Venezuelan people. excuse me, the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement demands the immediate cessation of all hostilities against the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, the full respect of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and inalienable rights to the self-determination of Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, and that those responsible for those ongoing acts of aggression to be held accountable. The Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement reaffirms the inviolability of the immunities accorded to the heads of states and government under international law, which constitute a fundamental pillar of sovereign equality, peace, coexistence, and stable international relations. These immunities, firmly rooted in customary international law and consistent with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, must be respected universally without discrimination, and any actions or measures that undermine or selectively disregard them risk eroding multilateralism, destabilizing international relations, and weakening the international legal order. Excuse me. Mr. President, the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement reiterates its full solidarity with the people and government of the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela at this critical time, and insists that military solutions are not viable avenues for addressing any issues that may be of concern between members of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Uganda for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba, who has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr.
Señor
President.
presidente,
Mr. President,
mi delegación se ve obligada a hacer
my
uso de la
delegation
palabra
feels it must take
para
the floor
responder a
again
las
to
acusaciones
respond to the
infundadas
unfounded
formuladas por la delegación de
accusations
Estados
formulated
Unidos
by
contra
the
Cuba.
United States against
Resulta
Cuba.
indignante
It
que
is,
quienes han
we are
protagonizado
indignant that those
agresiones
that have
unilaterales
led
y
unilateral
violaciones
aggressions and
sistemáticas del derecho
systematic
internacional
violations of
pretendan
international law
erigirse en jueces de otros estados
pretend to
soberanos,
judge
lo
other
que en una
sovereign
actitud
states
absolutamente inmoral
with a
e
totally
irrespetuosa
immoral
e
and
irresponsable.
irresponsible
Rechazamos
attitude lacking
categóricamente
respect. We
las calumnias de que
fundamentally
Cuba
reject
tiene
the
presencia de
accusations
inteligencia
that
en
Cuba
Venezuela.
has intelligence
Tales
assets in
afirmaciones
Venezuela.
carecen de toda
These
base
kinds of
fáctica
statements
y
lack any
constituyen un
factual
intento
base and
evidente
are a
de
clear
desviar la atención de la
attempt to
conducta agresiva y criminal de Estados
take the
Unidos
eyes of the world
en la
off the
región.
criminal acts of the
Cuba
United States
respeta
in the region.
estrictamente la
Cuba
soberanía, la
strictly respects
independencia
the
y el
sovereignty,
derecho inalienable
independence,
del pueblo
and
venezolano a
inalienable right
decidir
of
su
the
propio
Venezuelan
destino,
people to
tal como
decide their own
establece
destiny,
la Carta de las
as
Naciones
established
Unidas.
by the United
La
Nations
cooperación entre
Charter.
ambos países en
Cooperation
múltiples
between
esferas,
both countries
incluida la militar,
is in multiple
tiene
spheres,
bases legítimas
has
y se basa en
legitimate
acuerdos
bases,
bilaterales
and is
suscritos
based on
soberanamente por
bilateral
ambas partes.
agreements signed
Como ha
by
sido
both
declarado por
parties,
el
as has
gobierno
been
revolucionario,
declared by the
los
revolutionary
32
government, the
combatientes caídos víctimas
32
en un acto criminal de agresión
combatants
y
that
terrorismo al Estado
fell in terrorist
perpetrado por Estados Unidos
acts perpetrated by the
cumplían
United
misiones en
States were
representación de las Fuerzas
in
Armadas
missions
Revolucionarias y el
of the
Ministerio del
revolutionary
Interior
forces
a la solicitud de órganos heroicos de Venezuela.
at the
Estos
request
patriotas
of
supieron poner
Venezuela.
en
Those
alto con la
patriots
actuación heroica el sentir
were
solidario
heroic in
de
their
millones
action, showing
de cubanos.
solidarity
Esta
with
delegación
millions of
intenta
Cubans.
irrespetuosamente
These
tildar a
accusations
Cuba de intervención en
attempt to
Venezuela, lo cual rechazamos
suggest that Cuba is
categóricamente.
involved in this way in Venezuela. We categorically reject that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement. There is no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.